Chapter 608. Not everybody knew that the immortal Tan had arrived. As Jingjiu saw him, the immortal Tan was in the high sky, a black speck in the eyes of the people on the ground. The immortal Tan couldn't enter the empty realm with Jing Xian, so he didn't travel very fast. As a result, the small green curtain sedan led by Shui Yu Nunnery got ahead of him. It was also because his escape method of heaven and earth wasn't famous for its speed, which was similar to Lu Ci's in this aspect. The immortal Tan landed on the ground. More and more people noticed his arrival, uttering many surprised screams. Some chancellors walked out of the grand hall hurriedly. The divine crossbows on the city wall changed their direction automatically. The great formation of the royal palace reacted the fastest, emitting a deep green glow in an instant, as if it had turned into a solid ceramic piece. The great formation of the royal palace didn't have such a strong reaction even when a dozen cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school pressed forward. It could be imagined how powerful the great formation of the royal palace was. The patch of cloud and fog above the Intian gate grew thicker, enshrouding Baizhenren completely. Qing Feng, Chen Guang and the immortal Tan arrived together. Standing in the sky and looking at Jingjiu in front of the grand hall, the immortal Tan said, "You know who the great formation of the royal palace can't stop. 600 years ago, the Aoyama sect and other major sects in the world built the great formation of the royal palace together. If these sects couldn't even break through the great formation of the royal palace, it was tantamount to tying up their own hands, and the system of the plum meeting would be meaningless. Moreover, the Zhongzhou school played an important role in the design and construction of the great formation of the royal palace." The immortal Tan took out a jade board and showed it to heaven and earth in all directions. "The Cloud Dream Decree is issued. Heaven and earth receive it," he said with a dull expression. As this statement spread out in heaven and earth, a powerful and profound energy came out from his body. The light green circle enshrouding the palace halls suddenly grew a few times larger, and the invisible barrier grew thinner and more fragile, quivering slightly with the wind like a bubble that could burst at any moment. The immortal Tan intended to break through the great formation of the royal palace of Zhaoga City merely by employing the Cloud Dream Decree. The Zhongzhou school's cloud ships slowly moved forward again, preparing to take control of the entire imperial city the moment the formation was broken. Jingjiu raised his head and looked at the huge cloud ships in the sky. He flicked his finger and a snap sounded. Following his movements, the stone pillars that represented holiness in the palace suddenly shot out countless beams of clear light, shooting towards those cloud ships like giant arrows. Seeing this scene, the ministers and guards were all stunned. They were extremely familiar with the imperial palace, but they never thought that the stone pillars actually hid such power. In the depths of the royal palace, Master Jin and Master Niu were sitting across from each other, separated by a slowly rotating jade plate. Suddenly, the jade plate emitted an infinite amount of white light, and the powerful qi sent them flying into the wall. They looked at each other and saw the shock and helplessness in each other's eyes. It was only now that they realized that someone else was controlling the imperial city's grand formation. It was pointless for them to stay here and watch. The great formation of the royal palace was stabilized again. The Cloud Dream Decree was blocked by the green bamboo board in Jingjiu's hand. The cloud ships of the Zhongzhou school retreated again. A few large holes appeared on the belly of one of the cloud ships. A dozen Taoist masters were mending the holes nervously, hovering in midair. The immortal Tan exclaimed in surprise, "It turns out that the emperor has handed over the great formation of the royal palace to you." Jingjiu stood up and said, "I wasn't in Zhaoga City when the formation was built, but I'm familiar with this palace hall." It was then that the chancellors in the grand hall and the cultivation practitioners in the surroundings remembered that Jingjiu had another identity. He was the uncle of the emperor. The immortal Tan was not present at the time, so he didn't know about it. He said while looking at those stone pillars, "As far as I know, these weren't included in the original great formation of the royal palace. I think they were hidden by your big brother back then. Jingju said, I learned about them from his notes. He called them the 12 space-breaking magic cannons. It was said that one cannonball could kill a swordsman in the broken sea state. Hearing this, the scholars of Yamatsai on the boat of diligent study had a strange expression on their faces. The elders of the Zhongzhou school, like Yu Qianmen, who were in the Lianshu state, had terrible expressions on their faces. If what Jingjiu said was true, how many people would have died when the cloud ships of the center sect broke in when the great formation of the royal palace was opened? The immortal Tan said with a bitter smile, the sword comes out of Aoyama, and the people respect its straightforwardness. Who would have thought that it has so many tricks up its sleeves? Jingjiu said, You're right. What he said was true. The Zhongzhou school also had the Cloud Dream Decree as a backup, and even the Guoqing Temple and Yamatsai cultivation sects had some tricks up their sleeves, but nobody knew about it. But they still can't stop me. Having said this, the immortal Tan walked down from the sky. He was really using his feet. He walked down step by step, as if he was walking on an invisible ladder. His energy had been completely restrained, and he looked like a regular old man, or a part of the sky. The great formation of the royal palace had gradually calmed down, and the green glow had vanished without a trace. The dividing line could no longer be seen. When the immortal Tan was only a few thousand feet away from the ground, his gray hair and cloth suddenly tousled backward, as if a gust of wind had blown over his face. It was very peaceful in the sky. Where did the wind come from? The place where the wind came from was the edge of the great formation of the royal palace. The immortal Tan didn't stop there. He took another step in the sky. The strong wind whipped up, tousling his hair and cloth. The straight lines of his hair gave off a crisp and moving sound, like the fairy music. In the next moment the wind stopped. The immortal Tan had already arrived in the great formation of the royal palace, and he brought Jing Xian, a regular person, with him. The great formation of the royal palace couldn't stop him, the same as the great formation of Shui Yu Nunnery couldn't stop him. 600 years were enough for the Zhongzhou school, which had countless believers in Zhaoga City, to learn about the great formation of the royal palace and the methods employed by other sects, but it was still incredible that the immortal Tan could stroll into the great formation of the royal palace. It was probably the highest state of the magic methods of the Taoist sections. Seeing the immortal Tan land on the ground, there was a commotion in the royal palace. Dozens of officials rushed out of the grand hall and knelt down before him, calling him the immortal sect master. Some old chancellors bowed to Jing Xian from a distance, their old tears streaming down their cheeks. They looked very sad. Jing Yao got up slowly and left the throne. He came to the outside of the grand hall under the gaze of Prime Minister Qin and the others, looking at Jing Xian in the distance. The two brothers eyed each other, speechless. Jingjiu didn't pay any attention to the chancellors running past him. He said to the immortal Tan, Your heaven and earth wrong steps is indeed the best in the world, and it's the best in the last 1,000 years. You flatter me, immortal, said the immortal Tan. It's because I like to travel in heaven and earth that I know a thing or two about it. Jingjiu said, Though heaven and earth are vast, it's still too small for you. The immortal Tan said, Though the human world is small, it's already a wonderful place. There was a deep meaning behind these two sentences, but not many people could fully understand them. Jingjiu suggested that he shouldn't focus his attention on the human world and the throne, but should aim for a higher place. Yet, the immortal Tan advised Jingjiu that he shouldn't go against the will of the human world and the throne, and that it was not a good thing to bring chaos to the human world. A sorrowful cry of a bird broke out in the sky in the west. The cold signal bird of the Kunlun sect had arrived, and so had some other sects, but there were fewer of them than expected. Judging by the situation in Zhaoga City that day, the Zhongzhou school and the Aoyama sect, the two leaders of the orthodox cultivation sects, would probably start a war. Many sects who didn't think they were powerful enough didn't even dare watch the battle, for fear of being caught in the crossfire. None of the sects in the south were present. It was customary for the Mirror sect, the Platonist sect, and the Ozawa sect to be absent from the cultivation circle. What the people didn't understand was why the Aoyama sect didn't send anyone here. According to the rules of the plum meeting, the Aoyama sect couldn't interfere with the succession of the royal family, but who didn't know what the Aoyama sect had done over the years? Even if the sword boat of Aoyama didn't come, what about Yuan Qijing? What about Feng Jingtian? At the moment, Jingjiu was alone in the royal palace. Some people thought that Jingjiu, who claimed to be the immortal sect master of Aoyama, had been expelled from Aoyama. Did the Aoyama sect have no intention of starting a war with the Zhongzhou school? You can leave with the Prince Jing Yao and the royal concubine or go to Aoyama or the West Ocean. I swear as the sect master of Zhongzhou that I won't pursue them, and I can even guarantee their safety. The immortal Tan continued calmly while looking at Jingjiu. What I can also promise is that the plum meeting will remain the same, without any change. Through these two statements, the immortal Tan had clearly expressed the intention of the Zhongzhou school, which was to restore the original intention of the plum meeting, to control the whole of Chaotian by controlling the Jing imperial court, unlike what had happened over the last few years, when the Jing imperial court had gradually broken away from the control of the Cloud Dream Mountain and became a powerful sect on an equal footing with the major cultivation sections. The chaos in the world, the destruction of Zhaoga City, and the lives in misery and suffering are not what I want. Looking at the cultivation practitioners around him, the immortal Tan said, "Please testify for me, cultivation friends." His expression was still as dull as before, and his voice was still as dull as before, but he gave off a feeling that he was trustworthy. The scholars of Yamatsai on the boat of diligent study said something, but Bu Qiuxiao remained silent. The lotus sedan in the distant morning glow in the south was also quiet. Though the Guoqing Temple had always been close to the Jing imperial court, they had never participated in the fight for the throne, which was a rule of the temple. The only reason Zen master came here that day was Jingjiu. As long as Jingjiu was fine, he wouldn't have any objection. It was unclear if the Zhongzhou school had learned its lesson from the last few years, or it was because it was the immortal Tan who was in charge of the affairs this time instead of Bai Zhenren that the way they handled things had changed. Like what Tong Yen had predicted, they did things in an above-board manner. In the folk dramas and the common people, what the Zhongzhou school had done could be regarded as a rebellion, an extremely evil and wicked act. But it was not the case for the people in the cultivation circle. The major cultivation sects had always been the guardians and masters of the order in Chaotian. The imperial power had never been the highest, but the situation had changed slightly in the last few hundred years. If the Zhongzhou school wished to appoint an emperor, they only needed to discuss it with the Aoyama sect and other cultivation sects, no matter in terms of reason or reason. It was deathly quiet in the royal palace. Countless gazes were fixed on Jingjiu, waiting for his answer. Chapter 609. All of a sudden, a cloud boat belonging to the Zhongzhou school landed toward the west of Zhaoga City, along with the strong wind. What landed first was a mass of powerful fog, destroying many houses in an instant. The plum platform and the chessboard mountain were there. Though there were not many residential houses at the foot of the mountain, those who didn't evacuate in time would have been killed on the spot. The expression on Bu Qiuxiao's face changed slightly. He waved his hand to release the dragontail inkstone and aimed it at the cloud boat from a distance of 10 miles. A powerful and clean shapeless force grew between the dragontail inkstone and the cloud boat. If the cloud boat didn't stop moving, the dragontail inkstone would launch an attack at any moment. We have a deal. Today's battle will only take place in the royal palace. Bu Qiuxiao said this while looking at Bai Zhenren on the Intian gate. Bai Zhenren said calmly, "Tai Ping is over there." The manor of the minister of the Ministry of Rites was indeed not far from the chessboard mountain. Lying on the bed, San was eating a box of preserved fruits in his hand. It seemed that he was enjoying the fruits. Leaning against the window, Qing looked in the direction of the royal palace with a worried frown. A gust of wind suddenly rose in the garden, making the windows make a "pa" sound. Soon after, a huge shadow loomed over the manor of the minister. Looking at the cloud boat in the sky, San felt surprised, saying, "The Zhongzhou school is much stronger than before. How did they find me so quickly?" Since Qing was not the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect, she exposed him directly. "If you didn't release the news on purpose, how could they find me so quickly?" The curtain rollers and Bulow Lin had done many things in Zhaoga City last night. The Zhongzhou school didn't have enough time to react, but they still found many clues based on their many years of experience. Many of the clues pointed to the manor of the minister of the Ministry of Rites. The sect master and Bai Jinren are not on the cloud boat. The green girl shot a glance at the sky. She still had the habit of addressing San as before. She turned her head around and said to San in a mocking tone, "It's you Qianmen. Do you feel despised?" San smiled and said, "They are all very calm. If it were any other time, the immortal Tan and Bai Jinren would definitely come to pursue him in person once they learned of his whereabouts, in order to prevent him from escaping. However, such a thing did not happen today. The name Taiping Jinren sounded scary, but in fact, its combat power was limited. If Zhongzhou School really sent a top fighter over, the palace would be weakened. This was San's plan, but he didn't expect that Zhongzhou School would see through it. Even if Immortal Tan and Immortal Bai didn't come here in person, Yu Qianmen was a powerful cultivator in the Lianxu realm. With the help of the cloud boat, San couldn't deal with him. He reluctantly put down the box of preserved fruits, clasped his hands behind his back, and left the minister's mansion. The cloud boat of Zhongzhou School was flying at a high speed in the air 100 feet above the ground. Even though the wind was diverted by the formation, the huge boat still whipped up a terrifying gust of wind. Wherever the wind passed, the houses and courtyards collapsed, and the sand and pebbles flew in all directions. It was a terrifying scene. The truly terrifying thing was the fog released from the bow of the cloud boat. The invisible circular air waves were hidden in the fog, and the hard pavement was riddled with holes as deep as 100 feet. The residents of Zhaoga City, who hadn't evacuated yet, had no time to react. They died under the collapsed beams or were turned into green smoke by the fog. Standing at the bow of the boat, Yu Qianmen looked at the scene on the ground. He didn't show any sympathy on his face, but the expression in his eyes was extremely cold. It was not a big deal to injure mortals by accident, but the youth in red clothing in the ruins had such a peculiar movement that the magic lock of the cloud boat couldn't lock him. And the blue bird following him, was it that person? You did it on purpose, didn't you? Looking at the ruined streets and alleys behind her, Qing showed anger in her eyes. She flew to San's shoulder and landed on it, yelling at his ear. "Why are you so angry?" San felt a bit itchy. He tapped on a lotus flower with the tip of his foot and flew to an artificial hill 1,000 feet away like a wisp of smoke, picking his ear with his hand. Qing pecked his finger forcefully, yelling, "So many people have been killed because of you." The emperor stayed one more night because he wanted the residents of Zhaoga City to evacuate. These people didn't want to leave for all sorts of inexplicable reasons. They were seeking death. Looking at the cloud boat in the sky, San smiled faintly. His body suddenly vanished and arrived under a large green tree 100 feet away. He reached out his hand and caught the blue bird in front of him. "Remember, those people are not your own kind," he said while staring into her eyes. Qing felt a bit uneasy, asking, "What are you trying to say?" San said earnestly, "You're not a human being, at least you're not an immortal." Qing couldn't understand what this madman was thinking, yelling, "But you're an immortal. Regardless of whether he was a real human or Tai Pingzhenren, he was still an immortal. Yin San said nonchalantly, I haven't been an immortal for a long time. Even if Tai Pingzhenren were in Zhaoga City, you people still couldn't do it. Too many innocent residents would be killed or wounded. Looking in the direction of Yintian Gate, Buqiuxiao said sharply, otherwise we would be no different from him. The patch of cloud and fog didn't respond, but the cloud boat in Zhaoga City halted. It was unclear if it was the idea of Bai Zhenren or the Immortal Tan. It could be seen clearly in the royal palace that dozens of swordsmen of the Zhongzhou school, led by Yu Qianmen, flew down from the cloud boat and resumed the pursuit. But they did it in a much quieter manner. If it were any other time, everybody's gazes would be fixed on that spot, because Tai Pingzhenren was there, but they pulled back their gazes that day. Leading Jing Xian, the Immortal Tan walked toward the Grand Hall step by step. Hundreds of secret guards came out from the walls of the side rooms on both sides of the hall, pointing at the square with a nervous expression while holding the crossbows and all kinds of weapons. In comparison to the vast square in front of the Grand Hall, the figure of the Immortal Tan looked very small. But nobody would think so. The great formation of the royal palace could be activated at any moment, like when the commander of the Northern Divine Army was killed, but it was meaningless for a swordsman of the Immortal Tan's state. You can all leave now, Jing Yao's voice rang out in the Grand Hall. Though it was trembling slightly, he was still calm. It was evident that he didn't want those secret guards to die. Hearing what the new emperor said, the secret guards fell silent for a while before they left after receiving the order. The square became empty again. Jing Ju knew that he hadn't misjudged the new emperor. He left the stone steps and walked to the square, ignoring those chancellors kneeling in front of the Grand Hall. The Immortal Tan halted his steps. The two of them stared at each other calmly from a distance of a mile. The Immortal Tan said, "Now we can talk about this world." "Please," said Jingjiu. "I don't want Zhaoga City and this world to be destroyed because of us." The Immortal Tan continued, "This is a conflict of wills between the two of us, so it should be settled by us." "You're right," said Jingjiu. "You and I will each send out 3 people. The winner will decide the matter." The Immortal Tan continued, "The winner can continue the fight." This was what he meant by fighting to the end. This was the simplest way to settle the matter, but it was also too brutal. Even in the mortal world, only the gangs on the streets would do so. However, the replacement of the emperor and the fight for the leadership of the orthodox cultivation sects were essentially different from the fight for the right to collect protection fees from the vegetable stalls on the street. The Immortal Tan was indifferent to all this, and so was Jingjiu. He didn't mind fighting like the gangsters on the streets, but he had no intention of accepting his opponent's proposal. He had calculated it carefully before he left Aoyama. Even if he employed that move, he would only have a 90% chance of killing the Immortal Tan. What about the remaining 10%? The most troublesome part was that if he employed that move, he wouldn't be able to fight again. What about the remaining 2 fights? The dead dog wouldn't leave the sword jail. The snow girl was too ashamed to meet anybody. Yuan Qijing was old. She was still sleeping. She would lose for sure. Hearing the proposal of the Immortal Tan, the cultivation practitioners in the sky thought it was the best way to settle the matter. Only by fighting to the end could the world be spilled with blood. Yet, nobody thought that the proposal of the Immortal Tan was completely fair. It was because everybody could tell that the Aoyama sect had no chance of winning. The Immortal Tan and Bai Zhenren were the strongest swordsmen in Chaotian. Even the sword justice of Aoyama, Yuan Qijing, was slightly inferior to them, unless a principal guard of Aoyama participated in the fight. However, there was still a unicorn on Cloud Dream Mountain, who could defeat the 3 strongest swordsmen in the Zhongzhou school in a row. Not even the church master of the Bloody Demon Church could do it. The only person who could do it was the sword light that had traveled heaven and earth a few years ago. Thinking of that sword light, the cultivation practitioners of various sects had a slightly different mood. The departure of the immortal Lu Xi had a great impact on the Aoyama sect. As expected, Jingju didn't accept the proposal of the immortal Tan, saying, "I don't accept it." The immortal Tan was not surprised, saying, "Please tell me what you have in mind, immortal." Everybody thought that Jingju would request to increase the number of rounds or to change to another plan. They didn't expect his suggestion to be so unbelievable. "I'm the sect master of Aoyama, and you're the sect master of Center Sect. We can do whatever we want, why should we ask others to do it? And it's really annoying to make so many things happen." Jingju said, "I'll fight with you then." Chapter 610. It was deathly quiet in the royal palace and in the sky. The people looked at Jingju in front of the grand hall speechlessly, thinking that they had heard it wrong. "You want to fight the immortal Tan after cultivating for only a few decades?" The immortal Tan was undoubtedly the strongest swordsman in Chaotian. Like the immortal Lu Xi, he could break through the great formation of the royal palace easily, and his Dao magic had reached the highest state. "How could you be his equal?" The immortal Tan remarked sentimentally. "The confidence and demeanor of the immortal are still the same as before." "I'm the sect master of Aoyama, so of course I'll do it," said Jingju. "Even if you're the reincarnation of the immortal Jingyang, your cultivation state is still too low, so you're not my equal," the immortal Tan said earnestly while looking at him. Hearing this, the chancellor's voices grew quieter, and the cultivation practitioners in the sky looked pensive. It was true that the man in white clothing standing in the square of the royal palace was the youngest sect master of Aoyama, and he was probably the reincarnation of the immortal Jingyang. If this was the case, he should be so confident, even though his opponent was the immortal Tan. It was an arrogant thing for anybody else, but it was reasonable for the immortal Jingyang to be so confident. This was the consensus of the cultivation circle. It was like another consensus. "I've never met a true opponent," Jingju said. Jingyang had never had an opponent in his previous life, and he had never been defeated in his life. Everybody fixed their gazes on the immortal Tan again, eager to know his decision. Many people thought that the immortal Tan would accept Jingju's challenge. It was because Jingju had no chance of defeating the immortal Jingyang, even though he was the reincarnation of the immortal Jingyang. He had only experienced the heavenly tribulation for a short period of time. Unexpectedly, the immortal Tan shook his head after a long moment of silence. This meant that he didn't accept the challenge. After making this decision, the immortal Tan's expression became a bit more relaxed. The reason was complicated. In addition, there was a hint of regret in between his eyebrows. It was the greatest wish of the swordsman of his generation to fight the immortal Jingyang. Jingju said, "Each of the two sects will send 10 people to fight 10 rounds. If this was the case, then no matter how powerful Reverend Tan and Reverend Bai were, they would only be able to win 2 matches, and the outcome of the remaining 8 matches would be unknown." Upon hearing Jingju's words, a Yamatsai scholar raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "Are you preparing to face off against each other?" "No, this is his confidence in the Aoyama sect," Bu Qiuxiao said expressionlessly. It was very obvious that Jingju felt that other than the 2 enlightened masters, Tan and Bai, the rest of the experts from Zhongzhou school were not worth mentioning. They were definitely not a match for the sword cultivators of Aoyama. On second thought, it was indeed so. Excluding Yuan Qijing and Fang Jingtian, Guangyu Zhenren, Fu Wang, Nan Wang and Mo Qi, the elders in the peak of the Broken Sea realm or the upper level, were more than enough to wipe out all the enemies. After Lu Xi's departure, the fighting prowess of the Aoyama sect was not as strong as that of Zhongzhou school, but their intermediate fighting prowess was much higher than that of Cloud Dream Mountain. Jingju said calmly, "If you think this is not enough to show the full strength of the 2 sects, you can increase it to 100 rounds, or even 1,000. Hearing this, the Yamatsai scholar stopped talking, and the cultivation practitioners of other sects were speechless as well. The total number of the inner sect disciples of the Aoyama sect was about 1,000. Jingjiu was extremely confident in his own Aoyama sect. In the morning sunlight, the immortal Tan suddenly reached out his right hand and said, 5 rounds. The winner will continue. Those chancellors who had rushed out of the grand hall had already returned to the corridors. It was quiet in the square of the royal palace, resembling the wilderness. The immortal Tan and Jing Xian were the only ones standing there, and a small green curtained sedan was parked by the palace wall. Nobody noticed it. After a moment of silence, Jingjiu said, "Okay." There was another uproar in heaven and earth. Nobody thought the Aoyama sect would win. Even though Yuan Qijing had come to the royal palace in advance and the unicorn didn't come out, the Aoyama sect had no hope of winning. Who could defeat the immortal Tan? And the patch of cloud and fog above the Intian gate was glowing slightly under the morning sunlight. The immortal Tan didn't show any hint of joy on his face. "Please dismantle the great formation of the royal palace. Otherwise, it's hard to say that it's fair," he said dully. Though Jingjiu didn't do anything, everybody could sense that the great formation of the royal palace had been dismantled, and those stone posts had stopped glowing, turning back into inanimate objects. The immortal Tan raised his right hand, and a dozen cloud boats in the sky backed off until they were a few miles away from Zhaoga City. Seeing this scene, the people were startled. It was said that the Bai family was in charge of the Zhongzhou school and that the sect master was merely an empty position, but it seemed that it was not the case. "Please," said Jingjiu. The immortal Tan asked, "Which cultivation friend of the Aoyama sect will fight first?" Countless gazes looked up at the sky and the side hall, as if they would see the wind and snow in the next moment. The morning sunlight dyed the sky red, but there was no sign of rain, let alone snow. If Yuan Qijing didn't come, where would Fang Jingtian be? Who would fight if the 2 swordsmen of the heavenly arrival state of Aoyama were not here? Jing Xian left the immortal Tan and walked toward the palace wall, ignoring those eunuchs who were making way for him. The great formation of the royal palace had been dismantled, but the square had to be cleared and a new barrier had to be set up. Otherwise, the next 5 fights between the Aoyama sect and the Zhongzhou school would definitely destroy the entire royal palace. The immortal Tan stood in the square casually, his cotton cloth ruffling in the wind, but he gave off a feeling of unparalleled prowess. The people were certain that the immortal Tan would win the first fight, and they even thought that he would win 5 fights in a row. Both Zen Master and Buqiuxiao thought so. Nobody in Aoyama could defeat the immortal Tan, not even in all of Chaotian, unless the broadsword King Chao Yuan came from White Town. However, Chao Yuan was a member of the Guoqing Temple and the Windy Broadsword Church, but he was not a member of Aoyama. The immortal Tan stood in the square, waiting in silence, showing no sign of anxiety. The clearing of the square continued. The 2 Sir Golden Ox came out from the underground and took over part of the control of the great formation, setting up the barrier of Yuanqi. A secret guard and a few eunuchs were ready to carry the small green curtained sedan away after they ascertained that the area around the palace wall was safe. The few eunuchs were scared out of their wits that day, their faces pale. Looking at the figure of the immortal Tan in the square, their eyes full of fear. After being told by the secret guard in a low voice, they held onto the handle of the small green curtained sedan with trembling hands. It was then that a voice suddenly came out from the small green curtained sedan. "Did I allow you to move?" The voice was devoid of any emotion, and it was not pleasant either. It was quite ordinary. It was like the river and the ocean. It was like the peak of the sky and the sun. The voice was not loud, but it spread throughout the whole of the royal palace, Zhaoga City and heaven and earth. Someone was in the small green curtained sedan? Countless suspicious gazes were cast in that direction. Some of them wondered if it was the great Grand Master of Shui Nunnery who had come in person. Those chancellors in the Grand Hall who had seen Nanjing come to report the news were bewildered, wondering why there was someone else here. What the people found most eerie was that what the person in the small green curtain sedan said sounded like she was talking to those eunuchs, but it was more likely that she was talking to the immortal Tan and Jingjiu. "Did I allow you to move?" One of them was the immortal sect master of Aoyama, and the other was the immortal sect master of Zhongzhou School. In all of Chaotian, who had the qualification and courage to talk to them like this at the same time? At the beginning of the month, I reported to you that I would move to a new house this month, and there were many things to do. I had to prepare for my whole family in Hubei to avoid the summer heat, so I would update less frequently. I would try my best to update as much as possible. Here is the warning. However, it is quite interesting to think about it. Like what I had done in the past 10 years, I would stop updating for various inexplicable reasons when I encountered a blockbuster, and I would do the same when I encountered a climax. My body feels like that of the first child sword. Chapter 6:11. The voice coming out from the small green curtain sedan sounded a bit young. Some young disciples of various sects thought the voice sounded familiar, but they couldn't remember who it was. As for those high-level swordsmen, they had no idea who the voice was. They thought it was not a formidable figure in the Shui Yu nunnery sect. For some reason, the expression in the immortal Tan's eyes grew grave when he looked at the small green curtain sedan. In a courtyard outside the royal palace, San halted his steps and looked in the direction of the royal palace, the expression in his eyes changing slightly. He was as carefree as ever when the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school pursued him. He didn't mind Yu Qianmen and dozens of swordsmen of the Zhongzhou school following behind him. Yet, his expression was very cautious at the moment, and a hint of retreating showed in his eyes. The blue bird landed on his shoulder and asked confusedly, "What's wrong?" San remarked sentimentally, "I didn't expect that madman to still be alive and to come here." The eunuchs at the foot of the palace wall were startled, wondering why the sedan was not empty. Was it haunted this early in the morning? They were so scared that they fell to the ground and crawled away on all fours. A young woman walked out from the sedan after the green curtain was lifted up. She wore an ordinary dress and combed her hair in an ordinary style, and her face was also ordinary. There was nothing special about her, but she drew a series of soft exclamations. Guodong! The young disciples of some sects had seen Guodong of Shui Yu nunnery before, and they knew that she had an outstanding talent and a great ambition. But in fact, no one knew what she wanted all this time. Many years ago, Pei Baifa and the godly swordsman of West Ocean had a duel. Pei Baifa died in the duel, and the godly swordsman of West Ocean pretended to sink to the bottom of the ocean after being severely wounded. A disciple of Shui Yu nunnery attempted to assassinate the godly swordsman, but he was killed instead. Many people guessed that the person should be Guodong, and they thought that she had died at the time. Unexpectedly, she was still alive. Even if she was still alive, why did she walk out from the small green curtain sedan and say such a thing? And why did she come to Zhaoga City? No matter how outstanding her talent in cultivation was, she was merely a disciple of the younger generation with a low cultivation state. How dare she get involved in this matter? Watching her walk to the square, the people's gazes were filled with more and more shock. Guodong came to the middle of the square and said to the immortal Tan expressionlessly, "I had intended to sneak attack you or that woman of yours." Before she finished her words, the entire world was in an uproar. Everyone knew that she was talking about Baizhenren, but the problem was, who in this world dared to call Baizhenren a woman? Furthermore, a sneak attack? Who in the world dared sneak attack the immortal Tan? What made the crowd speechless was that the immortal Tan didn't get angry after hearing this, nor did he laugh. He remained as quiet as ever. The cloud above the Intian gate did not change at all. Guodong continued, "But since you are a nice person, I've decided to spare your life and fight with you directly." The immortal Tan didn't get angry. All he did was look at her in silence, as if he were looking at the most important issue in Chaotian. Everybody was stunned and on the verge of going crazy. How could she say that she would spare the Immortal Tan's life? This was too absurd. Guodong's energy was quite ordinary, and it hadn't improved at all since she came here from the small green curtain sedan. But as soon as she made this statement, her energy had changed abruptly. A ray of morning sunlight came from the east, shining on her body and her ordinary face. Boom! The violent wind whipped up in the square, rolling up the dust and leaves in the cracks of the green stone slabs and spinning around her body at a high speed. It looked like innumerable strands of silk had gradually turned into a large cocoon, trapping her in the middle. Some people thought that the Immortal Tan didn't want to lower himself to the level of this crazy disciple of the younger generation, so he employed the magic method to trap her. In the next moment, the large cocoon made of the wind, dust and leaves suddenly broke open, turning into countless green glows and dissipating in heaven and earth. Guodong was still standing in the same spot, but her energy was exceedingly powerful, even more powerful than the energy of the Immortal Tan. It was deathly quiet in heaven and earth. Everybody was shocked speechless. In the eyes of different people, the world was different, and she had a different appearance in the world. She was still as ordinary as ever, except that the lonely peak in the northernmost part was a bottomless abyss, a dazzling sun, and heaven and earth itself. Who was this ordinary-looking girl? The Immortal Tan looked at her in silence. The deep expression in his eyes had gradually changed, innumerable shooting stars flashing in his eyes, which were his thoughts. The lights of the shooting stars converged at one spot in the end, becoming exceedingly bright, indicating surprise, interest, and gratification. Lien Sanyue. The monster invasion of the Snowy Kingdom occurred more than 600 years ago. The royal family was in a civil war and the dynasty collapsed. The human race was faced with a catastrophe. The cultivation sects did their best to resist the Snowy Kingdom, so they had no time to deal with the affairs of the mortal world. Countless bandit soldiers appeared in the north, burning, killing, and looting everywhere, and even treating the populace like sheep. The populace of the world was in the most miserable state at the time. It was then that a talented disciple of Shui Yu nunnery left the East Ocean and headed to the north. She burned down 17 bandit strongholds and killed 40,000 bandit soldiers, including their families and children. She had changed the entire chaotic situation by herself. Nobody had practiced the principle of stopping the killing by killing more than she did. The soldiers were the lethal weapons, and the saints had no choice but to do so. She was the most ferocious swordswoman of that era, and also a true saint. It was because she had stabilized the situation that the cultivation sects had enough time to resist the monster invasion of the Snowy Kingdom and solve the problem, and the Plum Meeting was held later. The Plum Meeting was the main contributor to the peace of Chaotian in the last 600 years, and the two emperors of the Jing family had also contributed a lot. But nobody could forget who was the cause of all this. The talented disciple of Shui Yu nunnery was none other than Lien Sanyue. Lien Sanyue was undoubtedly one of the most powerful swordsmen in Chaotian, and she was considered to be the most likely to ascend successfully after the immortal Jingyang. In the years after the Plum Meeting, she could still be seen in the world once in a while, and every time she appeared, there would be a bloody battle. For some reason, she felt disheartened. She returned to Shui Yu nunnery and started cultivating behind closed doors, in an attempt to break through the path toward heaven. There were many rumors about her. Some said that she had died a long time ago, and some said that she had tried to ascend after the immortal Jingyang had ascended, but died because of the heavenly punishment. Unexpectedly, such a legendary figure was still alive, and she had turned into a regular disciple of Shui Yu nunnery and appeared in front of the world. When the people looked at the woman in the square again, what they saw was not the usual lonely peak, abyss, and sun, but a bloody ocean. She had never been an unworldly swordsman like the immortal Jingyang who didn't care about the affairs of the world, nor was she a kind and forgiving swordsman of the previous generation like the immortal Lu Si and the immortal Tan. She had a different image. In the history of the cultivation world, Lien Sanyue's cultivation state and fighting prowess could be ranked in a very high position, and she would be ranked even higher in terms of the number of people she had killed. If the people killed by Taiping Jinren and Emperor Shao in the world were not counted, nobody in Chaotian had killed more people than she had. An elder of a deviant sect, whose sect had been wiped out by her, had said indignantly before his death that she had killed more people than the church master of the bloody demon church back then. Looking at the ordinary woman, many people felt a sense of dread instinctively. They felt their lips were a bit dry, and those who had a guilty conscience even felt their legs turn to jelly. Jing Jiu looked at the woman in the square in silence. He didn't see any blood. All he could see was the scenery outside the round window. Guodong was Lien Sanyue. Though she didn't succeed in her ascension, she didn't die because of the heavenly punishment. At the critical moment, she chose the method of transforming a silkworm into a butterfly and was reincarnated. This kind of reincarnation was not the so-called reincarnation of the Zen sects. It was more like a transformation of the body. Her appearance had changed, her energy had changed, and her name had also changed. She was still the same person. This was one of the 3 paths Jing Jiu had told Zen Master about in the Guoqing Temple. In fact, Zen Master had told him about this path back when he was on the Shima Peak. He of course knew about this path because it was her Dao path. Unfortunately, they had different Dao paths, so they couldn't walk to the end together. They had traveled together once in their previous lives, but they had a falling out the first time. This time, they spent a lot more time together. It was because she pretended not to know him, and he pretended not to know her. It was a good arrangement. It was then that Bai Zhenren's cold voice rang out, "This is a matter between the Zhongzhou school and the Aoyama sect. Why are you standing there?" Lien Sanyue said with her hands folded behind her back, "This is a matter of the world. Anyone in the world can meddle in it, and I'm going to meddle in it. What can you do about it?" What she said was a bit crude, but it was reasonable. It was because the one with the bigger fist was the one in the right. Though her fists looked small and adorable behind her back, they could create a big hole in the sky if she punched them out. "You are not a member of the Aoyama sect after all," said Bai Zhenren. "But I am his," said Lien Sanyue with a faint smile. Because of this smile, her ordinary face suddenly became radiant and incomparably moving. She looked like a flower growing on the cliff wall of an abyss on a lonely peak under the sunlight. Chapter 6:12. It was quiet in heaven and earth. Am I his woman? Who? Woman? Lover? Madam? Who is he? Countless gazes fell on Jingjiu. There had been a rumor in the cultivation circle that Lien Sanyue had a crush on the immortal Jingyang. However, nobody could prove it. They could only make inferences based on the fact that Lien Sanyue had swept through Qingrong Peak and Nan Wang, who was said to hate the immortal Jingyang the most, cried all night long. Nobody dared to discuss this matter while the immortal Jingyang was still alive. The immortal Jingyang had left, and Lien Sanyue had disappeared, but the Aoyama sect and Shuiyu nunnery were still alive, so nobody dared to discuss this matter. It wasn't until many years later that someone said the same thing in the square of the royal palace under the gazes of tens of thousands of people. Many people felt bewildered. It was the bewilderment of witnessing the history with their own eyes, and they even felt powerless. They were eager to know what the other person would say. According to the temperament of the immortal Jingyang, he hadn't accepted Lien Sanyue back then, so he wouldn't admit it now. Those who were more realistic, like Duke Lu, thought nervously that if Jingjiu denied it, would the senior master Lien Sanyue still stand on the side of Aoyama and fight against the Zhongzhou school? Those who yearned for a better life, like Ping Yongka, thought anxiously that his master would be a jerk if he denied it at this moment. Those who enjoyed watching the fun, like Apiao, wondered how much fun it would be if Senior Master Zhao were here. After an unknown period of time, Jingju uttered Heaven and earth suddenly felt more relaxed. Duke Lu uttered jerk in his mind. Ping Yongka praised his master in his mind, but he thought that his master only uttered Though he knew it was his habit, he didn't think his master's response was too perfunctory and unkind in the eyes of a woman. A Piao floated on the beam in the deepest part of the palace, peeking at the scene in the square while clicking her tongue. Jingjiu had never said anything like that, not even anything similar. So even if it was just a soft hum, it sounded a little stiff. Did he need Lien Sanyue to help Aoyama? Of course not. Was it because she owed him too much in her previous life? Not really. Back in the West Ocean, he risked his life to save her and sewed up his bones, internal organs, muscles, and skin with her natural worm silk. Then, he treated his wounds with her in Diyuan City and traveled around the world for a few years. Then, he went to the Cloud Dream Mountain to participate in the Tao competition and snatched the fairy book of longevity. He risked his life to refine the fairy awareness left by Bai Ren in the fairy book of longevity. Finally, he poured all the fairy aura into her body. No matter how much he owed her, it should be enough. However, what he didn't realize was that there were many things that couldn't be cleared just by returning them. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter. This life was this life. He had given her life. Those threads were still in his body. Of course, she belonged to him. Lien Sanyue took out a peach blossom from her sleeve and inserted it into her hair. Jingju recognized that it was the peach blossom he left by her when he went to Shuiyu Nunnery. He was no longer nervous, curling up the corners of his mouth as he smiled. If Lien Sanyue's earlier smile was like a flower blooming in the abyss, as he smiled, all the flowers in heaven and earth bloomed. Lien Sanyue didn't like his smile. She turned her head around and said to the distant Intian gate, "I don't like you. Don't talk to me today." Then, she turned to the immortal Tan and said, "If you don't like it, you can always find a helper. You have nothing to be afraid of since you have many righteous people." It was true that she was Lien Sanyue. If she thought what they had done was wrong, she would start a war and kill them. It had nothing to do with who she was. Above the Intian gate, the clouds and fog were still the same. They couldn't see Bai Jinren's face, nor could they tell what she was feeling at the moment. All they could hear was that she said, "Mr. Qingtong, it looks like you have to strike first." A dozen cloud boats had retreated from Zhaoga City. One of the cloud boats on the outskirts was farther away, looking like a lonely sail in the distance. There were only a few disciples of the Zhongzhou school on that cloud boat, so they could only keep the cloud boat moving, but they couldn't launch any attack on Zhaoga City. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school couldn't help but look at the stern of the cloud boat nervously. A person was sitting in the shadow of the boat at the stern, his head covered by a coarse cloth, covering his whole body. It was unclear whether he was afraid of the sunlight or hated it. As the voice of Bai Jinren rang out on the cloud boat, the person took off the cloth covering his head slowly, revealing his true self. The person wore a green cloth, his face pale, his hair disheveled. It was unclear how many years he hadn't washed his hair. His eyes were sunken, giving off an eerie feeling. He was Ko Qingtong, whom Tong Yen had mentioned before, the old weirdo who had been hiding in the back mountain of Cloud Dream Mountain for many years. Looking at the morning sun in the east, Ko Qingtong displayed a disgusted expression as he said, "If you want me to strike, you have to give me the fairy book first." His voice was very dry, sounding like the rubbing of two rocks, as if he hadn't drunk water for 1,000 years. "If you were killed by that woman, the fairy book would be useless to you." The voice of Bai Jinren rang out on the cloud boat again. Ko Qingtong went on with narrowed eyes, "Do you think someone in this world can kill me?" Bai Jinren said, "That woman is the most capable of killing people in this world." Ko Qingtong let out an eerie laugh as he said, "The Zhongzhou school is getting worse with each generation. You're much worse than your grandmother, but you're using such a clumsy method to provoke me. I really don't understand how you managed to cultivate to your current cultivation state with such a terrible temperament. Did you rely on taking pills? You were called the most capable devil man when you were at the Bloody Demon Church, but I'm not trying to provoke you, it's because she happens to be the same kind of person. As for me, I'm the current me regardless of whether it's because of taking pills or the legacy of my ancestors. You don't dare attack me casually. As such, this is the only way for you to obtain the fairy book. Bai Zhenren's voice was as calm as ever. Ko Qingtong stood up in a strange posture and walked toward the front of the cloud boat. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school made way for him in tandem. They didn't even dare take a look at him. Ko Qingtong came to the bow of the cloud boat and looked at the distant royal palace, asking, "Is that little girl really so formidable?" "She's indeed the strongest in the world when it comes to killing people," Bai Zhenren said. Countless bloody streaks suddenly appeared in Ko Qingtong's eyes, his crazed intent growing stronger. "It's interesting," he said. "I'll go kill her then." No sooner had he said this than he vanished from sight. A dozen patches of thick fog appeared in front of the cloud boat, and there was a hole in each patch of fog, extending toward the royal palace of Zhaoga City. The sky above Zhaoga City was filled with the morning sunlight, looking very beautiful. The sunlight obscured the Lotus Sedan in the southeast, as well as many people's eyes. It was said that it would rain in the morning and be sunny in the evening. It looked like it would rain that day, but the sky was still sunny in the early morning, with no sign of rain to be seen. It was then that countless thunderous booms suddenly broke out in the sky. Boom! Boom! The populace hiding in Zhaoga City covered their ears painfully, and the magic army on the city wall displayed a pained expression. A dozen divine crossbows on the highest points were fired automatically, aiming at a spot in the sky and moving at a high speed, but they were deformed by the formidable energy following the thunderous booms. Looking at the loquat tree swaying in the wind in the courtyard, Yin San exclaimed with furrowed eyebrows, "This vicious person is still alive." It was rare for Qing to see Jingjiu with such a grave expression, and it happened twice in a row. She couldn't help but feel startled. How many people or things in the world could make Taiping Zhenren feel alarmed? Yin San took out the bone flute and calculated silently while looking at the round holes on it. A few moments later, he said, "The southeast city wall." Qing grew more curious, wondering if Jingjiu didn't want to watch the show. "What are you going to do there?" she asked. Yin San glided toward the outside of the courtyard with the bone flute in his hands behind his back, saying, "I'm going to kill someone." The expression on Qing Er's face changed slightly. She knew that though Jingjiu had caused chaos in the world and killed many populace, he hadn't killed many people with his own hand. Yin San knew what was on her mind, saying with a faint smile, "This person is worth killing with my own hands." During the time that Yin San calculated, dozens of thunderous booms broke out in the sky above Zhaoga City. Along with the thunderous booms, someone came from outside Zhaoga City, breaking through the sky and creating a great deal of thick fog, arriving in the square of the royal palace. The strong wind was whistling, and his green robe was tousled like a flag, as was his messy hair. Everybody was wondering who this person was and why he was so powerful. He didn't look weak even when standing beside the immortal Tan. Jingjiu knew that this person should be Ko Qingtong at the back of the Cloud Dream Mountain, so he took a few steps forward. Lien Sanyue arched her eyebrows slightly, thinking that it was indeed an interesting day. She had woken up in time, because that person had a familiar energy. This kind of energy was rarely found on a regular person, and it was hard to sense it even on someone like the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect. It could only be sensed by those who had killed many people with their own hands and didn't regard other people as human beings and themselves as human beings. Ko Qingtong sensed the same energy on Lien Sanyue. He grinned at her, his eyes full of cruelty. Before the immortal Tan could say anything, Ko Qingtong had already flown to the opposite side. He arrived in front of Lien Sandway a mile away in an instant, thrusting his fist forward. He didn't use any magic treasure, flying sword, command board, magic method, or anything else. It was a simple punch. As a matter of fact, he had already punched out as soon as his feet left the ground. The fist broke through the air, giving off a deafening boom of thunder and a great deal of flames. The wailing of ghosts and the resentment of the wronged souls could be vaguely heard. The flaming fist exuded two colors, black and red. Ko Ching-tong's body drew an eye-catching mark on the square of the royal palace. It looked like a shooting star with the heavenly demons of the outside world attached to it. Lien Sandway found that this person was more powerful than she had imagined. He could be considered the strongest opponent she had ever encountered in her life. This punch was almost as powerful as the sword wielded by the godly swordsman of West Ocean with all his might. She felt a bit regretful, but it was too late. The fist had already arrived in front of her. All she could do was put her palms together to block it. A huge explosion reverberated through the imperial city. It was even more frightening than the dozens of thunderclaps from before combined together. The strong wind was also echoing in the royal palace. It hit the palace wall after traveling a distance of 3 miles. The red layer of the wall peeled off, and the formation was damaged a great deal. Lien Sandway was nowhere to be found. A deep and bottomless hole appeared on the spot where she had been standing. Chapter 6:13. It was deathly quiet in the royal palace. Looking at the strange man in green clothing, the people were so shocked that they couldn't utter a word. Sir Jean and Sir Nyo sensed the feedback from the great formation of the royal palace. They eyed each other and saw the fear in each other's eyes. If this punch had landed on them, they would have been smashed into powder even if they used all their magic treasures. Many swordsmen of cultivation sects had seen Jingju punch at the grand ceremony of the sect master of Oyama. At the time, Jingjiu had punched senior master Tai Lu in the wheelchair to death while holding the seal of the king of the underworld, but it was nothing compared to this punch. What made these swordsmen of cultivation sects feel even more fearful was that the method employed by this person was obviously not the method of any of the major sects, nor was it the method of any deviant sect. Looking at the strange man in green clothing, Lu Shui somehow felt a sense of familiarity, his expression a bit bewildered. Buqiuxiao shot him a glance, but didn't say anything. On the distant lotus sedan, Zen Master fell silent after uttering the name of the Buddha. Some older cultivation swordsman seemed to have recalled something. A terrified voice suddenly burst out in the sky, "The bloody demon church!" Hearing this, more people recalled something. The deviant sects were the most powerful in Chaotian 1,000 years ago, and the bloody demon church had wreaked havoc in the world. It wasn't until it was suppressed by the Zhongzhou school, the Aoyama sect and other orthodox cultivation sects that the bloody demon church withdrew from the stage of history. However, the bloody demon church was still regarded as the only orthodox and spiritual ancestor by all the deviant sections. Was the strange man in green clothing a remnant of the bloody demon church? However, the bloody demon church had been wiped out a long time ago. Even if some secret scripts of the magic methods were lost, it was impossible for him to practice such a formidable and orthodox method without being taught by his master. Was this person a swordsman of the bloody demon church who had survived until now? If so, he must be more than 1,000 years old. Why did he come out from the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school and stand by the immortal Tan? How formidable was the bloody demon church 1,000 years ago, and how formidable was the swordsman of the church? It was no wonder that even Lien Sanyue couldn't withstand one punch from this person. Many people looked at Jingjiu, but they found that Jingjiu's expression was calm. He was not sad, not even worried. Ko Ching-tong pulled back his right fist and shot it a glance, his eyes full of cruelty and appreciation. Suddenly, he realized that many people were looking away from him. He looked over and saw Jingjiu. He was slightly startled and said, "Are you the next to die? It's a pity that he doesn't know how to kill." San said that he came to Zhaoga City to watch the play, but in fact, someone else had been watching the play the entire time, and his position was much better than San's. In the side hall, Ping Yongka witnessed the passing of the emperor, the royal concubine crying like a little kitten, the ascension of the new emperor, the arrival of the immortal Tan from the sky, and Lien Sanyue coming out of the bridal sedan chair and claiming that she was his master's woman. He had watched all the plays about life, tragedy, court affairs, xianxia, and lovers in one day. It seemed that he intended to experience all the joys and sorrows of the human world. However, the wonderful play stopped abruptly after Lien Sanyue appeared. The strange man in green clothing had knocked Lien Sanyue to the ground with one punch, and it was unknown whether she was dead or alive, and then he claimed that he would kill his master. Ping Yongka felt both scared and angry, but he was fully aware that his opponent could kill him with a single breath. He couldn't do anything about it. It was then that he heard the surprised scream in the sky and the anxious discussion of the chancellors in the grand hall. He pushed open the door of the side hall and yelled toward the square after rolling his eyes. The Zhongzhou school claims to be the leader of the orthodox cultivation sects, but it harbors the evildoers of the bloody demon church in secret. You people are shameless. What qualifications do you have to contend with my master? The exaggerated voice of the young disciple of Aoyama echoed in the royal palace. However, neither the officials in the Grand Hall nor the cultivation practitioners of various sects in the sky paid any attention to him, and nobody followed him in denouncing the Zhongzhou school. Ping Yongjia felt quite embarrassed. When he found that the strange man in green clothing was looking at him, he felt even more scared. He closed the window with a pa sound and pulled the quilt over his head. In the next moment, he remembered that the emperor had passed away on this very bed. He couldn't help but feel even more scared. He rubbed his hands together and apologized to the emperor, saying, "Please don't blame me. That person was a surviving member of the Bloody Demon Church, and he might have been a high-level member of the Bloody Demon Church 1,000 years ago. But he had joined hands with the Zhongzhou school. Normally, this should have aroused the anger of all the orthodox cultivation sections. None of the sects said anything. It was not because they were afraid of the reputation of the Zhongzhou school. It was because even the Zen master and the scholars of Yamatsai remained silent. The reason was simple. When they remembered who this strange man in green clothing was, they also recalled the past. The Zhongzhou school had obtained the consent of all the orthodox cultivation sects to take in this strange man in green clothing 1,000 years ago. At that time, the Bloody Demon Church was on the verge of defeat under the siege of the orthodox cultivation sections. However, the Bloody Demon Church still had numerous masters and terrifying killing formations in the headquarters of the Bloody Demon Church. It was very difficult for the orthodox cultivation sects to eliminate them completely, and they would have to pay a terrible price. At the most critical moment, Byron postponed her ascension and subdued the Devil's Child, who had a high position and terrifying strength in the Bloody Demon Church. Through the Devil's Child, the orthodox cultivation sects got hold of a lot of internal information about the Bloody Demon Church and successfully attacked the headquarters of the Bloody Demon Church. In the final battle, the Devil's Child even sneak attacked the master of the Bloody Demon Church, who had a peerless demonic skill. The master of the Bloody Demon Church was wounded by the sneak attack, and in the end, he was killed by the joint attack of Byron and the immortal Daoyuan. The destruction of the Bloody Demon Church was the result of the bloody battles fought by the orthodox cultivation sects for more than 100 years. However, the Devil's Child's abandonment of the dark side for the light side had undoubtedly played a crucial role. This Devil's Child was none other than Ko Qintong, who was standing in the square of the royal palace. According to the agreement between him and Byron, he had been cultivating and living in the back valley of the Cloud Dream Mountain. The whole cultivation circle knew about this, but many people had forgotten about it as time elapsed. It wasn't until he appeared in front of the people today and killed Lien Sanyue with one punch that he returned to their memories. At the time, Ko Qingtong had to be subdued by the fairy lady by Ren in person, and he was able to sneak attack the master of the Bloody Demon Church without being killed. It was evident how powerful his cultivation state was. Even though he hadn't ascended yet and his spiritual soul and body were a bit weakened after more than 1,000 years, he was still one of the top swordsmen in Chaotian, and should be as powerful as the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island, Nan Chu. Lien Sanyue had been defeated. Who else in Chaotian could defeat him? Who else in Aoyama could defeat him? The people looked at Jingjiu again, wondering what the Aoyama sect would do next. Yet, Jingjiu looked at the boat of diligent study in Yamatsui in the sky. Lu Shisui looked at the strange man in green clothing in the square in bewilderment. The familiar feeling grew more and more apparent. He hadn't seen Ko Qingtong before, nor did he have any karmic connection with this person. The familiarity came more from the energy and the smell back when he swallowed the devil pill at the bottom of the muddy river. He learned the secret deviant methods passed down by the Bloody Demon Church. That method helped him grow at an unimaginable speed, but it also brought many hidden dangers to his body. He was forced to study the Buddhist scripts in the vegetable garden outside the Guoqing temple for many years, and then he went to Yamatsui to study the Orthodox sects for many years before the hidden dangers gradually disappeared. Looking at Ko Qingtong that day, the demonic energy in the deepest part of his Tao tree and the tiniest meridians suddenly became active, spreading like a wildfire. His face turned ashen. He swayed a few times while clutching his chest, and had almost fallen off the boat of diligent study. Buqiuxiao had been paying attention to Lu Shisui since he had ascertained the identity of Ko Qingtong. Finding that his energy was stimulated, Buqiuxiao raised his eyebrows slightly. He grabbed a handful of gentle wind with his right hand and poured it into Lu Shisui's ear. As the gentle wind washed his pulse, Lu Shisui felt the annoyance in his chest eased a bit. He thanked the teacher and looked at the strange man in green clothing in the square, a hint of fear in his eyes. Ko Qingtong also sensed the demonic energy of the same source not far away. As he turned around, he saw Lu Shisui. "I didn't expect our church to have another disciple," he exclaimed in surprise. In the next moment, he found that Lu Shisui was on the boat of diligent study in Yamatsui. The expression in his eyes grew cold instantly. "I don't like the hypocritical scholars in Yamatsui the most," he said in a hoarse and unpleasant voice. "Now that you have practiced the magic method of our church, how can you join their sect?" His voice grew louder and louder. When he talked about the hypocritical and righteous scholars, it was still normal, but when he talked about how he could join their sect, he was extremely furious. His voice was so loud that it turned into countless bolts of thunder, reverberating in the palace. Along with the thunders came the violent and brutal energy of the Orthodox Bloody Demon Church exuding from his body. It was easier for the other cultivation practitioners of the Orthodox sects, as long as they guarded their hearts with their wills, but Lu Shisui had no way to resist the invasion of the demonic energy. The demonic energy in his body suddenly broke out and rampaged in his meridians. Whoosh! Lu Shisui spat out a few mouthfuls of black blood, looking extremely miserable. Buqiuxiao fed Lu Shisui a magic pill with a grave and stern expression on his face. Then, he asked Shiyun to help Lu Shisui to take a rest in his cabin. The small formation for crossing the river was set up in the cabin, which should be able to resist the invasion of Ko Qingtong's soundless demonic energy. Jingjiu pulled back his gaze from the boat of diligent study and looked at Ko Qingtong in the distance, as if he were looking at a dead man. He was of course no match for Ko Qingtong at the moment, just like how he couldn't defeat the immortal Tan, but it didn't mean that he couldn't kill Ko Qingtong. Yet, he was fully aware that even if Ko Qingtong was killed that day, it would not be him who did it. A whimpering sound suddenly broke out in the underground of the royal palace. It was unclear if it was the whistling wind above the underground river, the wronged ghosts in the fiend prison coming out, or the lingering effect of Ko Ching-tong's fist. Many people noticed that the sound came from the hole in the middle of the square. The sound grew sharper and sharper. All of a sudden, a column of water shot out from the hole, shooting up to the sky and dissipating after it reached a height of 100 feet. As the underground river receded into the hole, Lien Sanyue came back. Her dress was soaked through, her black hair hanging on her face. The blood on the corners of her mouth, and the blood on her dress hadn't been washed away by the river water. She looked to be in a sorry state. Seeing her, Ko Ching-tong exclaimed with a slightly surprised expression, "You're not dead yet." Chapter 6:14. Lien Sanyue didn't pay any attention to him. She wiped off the blood from the corners of her mouth, and waved her sleeve slightly. A gentle wind enshrouded her body. It didn't take long for her to be as clean as before. In the side hall, Ping Yongka had already gotten off the soft bed stealthily. He looked at the outside anxiously through a crack in the window. Seeing this scene, he couldn't help but be amazed, thinking that it was much more beautiful than his master and senior master Zhao washing their faces with the sword fire. It was then that the people noticed that her hair was very long, hanging down to the side of her waist, but it was hard to tell because she usually wore her hair in an ordinary bun. Her long black hair tousled like a waterfall in the gentle wind. It was a beautiful sight. "It looks like you've killed many people. Your technique is pretty good." Lien Sanyue said this to Ko Ching-tong expressionlessly, but everybody could sense her appreciation for him. It was a graceful gesture for the winner to express his appreciation for the loser, but it was quite odd for the loser to express his appreciation for the winner. Staring at her eyes, Ko Ching-tong said in a mocking tone, "I saw the regret in your eyes a moment ago." "I do regret a bit," said Lien Sanyue. What did she regret? Did she regret knowing Jingyang back then? Or did she regret standing up against the Zhongzhou school? Soon after, everybody heard what she said next. "I've never been afraid of being wounded, but I don't like being wounded either. Being wounded might make a regular person burn up their fighting will, but my fighting will never diminish, so I don't need it. Being wounded will only make me weaker. That's why I should strike first." Lien Sanyue's statement was a bit long, and it took some time for the people to understand what she meant. What did she mean? Did she mean that she didn't like being wounded, so she should strike first? Did it mean that her opponent had no chance to strike again as long as she struck first, and could only wait to be defeated by her? Lien Sanyue was qualified to make such a statement, but her opponent that day was a swordsman of the Bloody Demon Church 1,000 years ago, Ko Ching-tong, who could only be subdued by the great ancestor Bai Ren. She didn't show any fear. On the contrary, she felt a bit displeased because she was wounded. What a self-confident and unyielding person she was. The gentle wind blew over the square, pulling her black hair like her fingers back then. Jingzhi looked at her black hair that was like a waterfall. His eyes were full of admiration, but he didn't know if it was for her hair or her person. Tong Yen thought that Jingzhi liked Zhao Leia's short and messy hair, so she told the underworld master that he would like Apiao more if she cut her hair short. Only the people on Shima Peak knew that he had always hoped that Zhao Leiu could have long black hair. As for the fight between Lien Sanyue and Ko Ching-tong, Jingzhi was not worried at all. She had never lost, except for that one time with him. Staring into Lien Sanyue's eyes, Ko Ching-tong's expression grew serious. An extremely thick stench of blood and a seemingly tangible killing intent gradually accumulated between the two of them before spreading out in all directions. No matter how hard the breeze blew, it could not lighten the smell. The eunuchs and secret guards hiding on the other side of the palace walls turned pale and found it difficult to breathe. The officials in the grand hall felt their hearts beating faster. Even Gongfeng Jin and Gongfeng Niu furrowed their eyebrows slightly. They had to use the energy of heaven and earth to protect their heart meridians so that they wouldn't miss any details of the fight. Ping Yongka pulled a chair and sat by the window. He pushed open the window arrogantly with a cup of tea in his hand, ready to watch the fight. I heard that you're the most vicious and the one who has killed the most people in 600 years, said Ko Qingtong, while staring into Lien Sanyue's eyes. That's right, said Lien Sanyue. I was the most vicious and the one who killed the most people 1,000 years ago. The expression on Ko Qingtong's face was unprecedentedly serious as he asked, Have you ever counted how many people you've killed? It's not worth counting, retorted Lien Sanyue. Ko Qingtong displayed a disappointed and even angry expression on his face as he demanded, Do you feel uncomfortable about killing people? No, said Lien Sanyue. I just don't think it's important. Ko Qingtong was baffled, asking, Isn't it an honor? Lien Sanyue said after some thought, I've never been proud of killing people, I'm proud of being able to kill people. Such a simple sentence clearly showed the gap between the two of them. It was like the difference between heaven and earth. I won't let you strike first again. You can try my fist now. Having said that, Lien Sanyue took a breath casually. A large amount of energy of heaven and earth came to her side, entering through her nose and then exhaling through her lips. The gentle wind blew by her side, tousling her black hair. Her black hair tousled in the air, as if it would cut the space in half. Pa! The broken space that had just formed was shattered by a small fist. The fist kept moving forward, letting out increasingly dreadful shrieks as it rubbed against the air. Then it suddenly fell silent. Ko Qingtong murmured with a grave expression, Damn it, how could she be so powerful? Lien Sanyue's fist vanished from the sight of the crowd, as well as heaven and earth. So did her opponent. On the vast square of the royal palace, there was nothing but the gentle morning wind and a few green leaves twirling along with the wind. All of a sudden, the green leaves turned into the tiniest particles, dispersing with the wind. In the meantime, a very thin line appeared in the square. The thin line emitted a light, but it was brought forward by the line before it could travel far. It was easy to imagine how fast the line traveled. If Ko Qingtong's fist was like a shooting star falling down from the outside world with an unimaginably formidable power and an exceedingly gloomy and cold demonic energy, Lien Sanyue's strike was much more ordinary, but it was impossible to evade it. The swordsmen in the cultivation circle could evade the lightning because they could see the light of the lightning in advance. But who could evade the light itself? Ko Qingtong was exceedingly vigilant. He unleashed the demonic energy and the secret method of the Bloody Demon Church. A great deal of smoke-like energy came out from his hands and wrapped around his body like black and red silk, wrapping him up tightly. As the light disappeared abruptly, Lien Sanyue appeared in front of him, her fist landing on the smoke-like demonic energy. Along with a tearing sound, the black and red demonic energy broke apart abruptly and then dropped down feebly, drifting toward the sky. Lien Sanyue's fist strike was very simple. It didn't even have any movement, to say nothing of the mysterious will of the Dao Sex or the true Mirror Lake method. It was similar to the simplest punching method learned by the practitioners of the martial arts in the mortal world. Yet, the secret method of the Bloody Demon Church couldn't withstand this fist for even a moment. The fist kept moving forward, like a young girl fighting with her big brothers in a small courtyard of an escort agency. It broke through Ko Qingtong's hands easily and landed on his chest. Pa! Pa! There was no thunder. Ko Qingtong's body trembled slightly, his messy hair tousling in front of him. Countless tiny tears appeared on his cloth. It was because he was knocked away so fast that neither his hair nor his clothes could react in time. The rims of his cloth created many lines of fire as it rubbed against the air. Then, the rims of his cloth tore open, exposing his wounded body. Boom! Ko Qingtong broke through the palace wall and flew backward. A large breach appeared on the palace wall, but he didn't stop there. He kept flying toward the south of the royal palace, bringing down a great many residences along the way. A tremor occurred on the ground, and the Incheon gate quivered slightly. A great deal of smoke and dust rose up among the beams, and a pit appeared on the hard stone wall. There was a straight and deep ditch from the pit to the square of the royal palace. Nothing could exist in the ditch. The lower half of Ko Ching-tong's body was stuck in the deep ditch, and the upper half of his body was leaning against the stone wall of the Incheon gate. Looking at the morning sunlight in the sky, the expression in his eyes was rather peculiar, showing a hint of bewilderment and anger. Chapter 6:15. How could he be knocked flying by someone? He was knocked flying by a single punch. It was impossible. The bewilderment and anger in Ko Ching-tong's eyes turned into a wild fire, which started to burn violently. With a howl like a wild animal, Ko Ching-tong bounced up from the ground and flew back to the royal palace by stepping on the stone wall of the Incheon gate. The rocks and dust in the straight and deep pit bounced up with a thud. The Incheon gate started to collapse slowly with a cracking sound, and the patch of cloud and fog drifted into the sky. Ko Ching-tong came back even faster than he had left. He reached out his right hand and grabbed at the sky. He pulled down a patch of morning sunlight, which turned into a patch of blood-red light and smashed down. Lien Sanyue's sleeve tousled slightly, rolling up a patch of cloud and turning it into a sea of flowers in the sky. Every trace of blood in the bloody light was Ko Ching-tong's fist, and every flower in the sea of flowers was Lien Sanyue's fists. The fists met. The lethal wills collided with each other. The morning sunlight reflected on the sea of flowers. Byung-hong, blood-red, grimacing face. The figures of Lien Sanyue and Ko Ching-tong were nowhere to be seen in the square of the royal palace. All that could be seen was the violent wind and the bloody energy. The thunder boomed again, and then it didn't stop. The air waves hit the palace walls with the sand and gravel, making paw sounds like the rainstorm. The red palace wall, which had its outer layer peeling off, was now riddled with holes, looking like the beach after the rain. It was a dreadful sight. The sand and gravel shot toward the palace hall like arrows and raindrops. The chancellors went back to the grand hall in tandem. Ping Yongka closed the window as quickly as he could and put down the teacup to protect his face. Jingju didn't move. He looked in that direction in silence. Sir Jean and Sir Nyo sat on the ground with their eyes closed and legs crossed, their faces pale. They were trying their best to maintain the operation of the great formation of the royal palace to prevent these two formidable figures from destroying everything here. At the most dangerous moment, the immortal Tan waved his sleeve and sent an extremely pure Jin Yuan into the stone post, stabilizing the great formation. After an unknown period of time, without any warning, the thunder stopped and so did the gale. A gap appeared in the morning sunlight in the sky, making it look even more beautiful. Lien Sanyue and Ko Ching-tong stood facing each other, a few miles apart. Ko Ching-tong was panting heavily, his body covered in blood. "Why are you so resilient?" he asked Lien Sanyue in bafflement. It was evident that Lien Sanyue's condition was much better. Her black hair tousled in the wind, but there was a streak of blood on the corner of her mouth. "It's because you are too weak," she said. A hint of ferocity flashed in Ko Ching-tong's eyes as he said, "It's because you haven't seen the true cruel side of me." The expression on Lien Sanyue's face suddenly changed slightly, as she reached out her right hand and caught a falling petal. The peach blossom that she had stuck in her hair finally had a petal fall off. Looking at the flower petal in her palm, a hint of pity appeared on her face. Then, her eyes became even colder, or rather, merciless. For some reason, Ko Ching-tong felt a sense of trepidation in his heart. The peach blossom was still in her hair even though the fight was so intense. Did she not exert her full strength? Lien Sanyue lifted her head and asked him expressionlessly, "Do you know what I look like when I'm truly cruel?" Having said that, she opened her arms, her jade-like hands reaching out from the sleeves, her palms facing up toward the sky. The ocean of clouds started rolling up and down. The morning sunlight in the sky was torn to shreds by a tremendous invisible force, spreading out in all directions like the blood dripping down from the roof of the house. The sky grew bluer, and then turned into a dark blue color, as if it was closer to the ground. Lien Sanue's palms sank down slightly. If one were to link these two images together, it would even make one feel as if the sky had fallen onto her palm. Seeing this, Ko Qingtong let out a strange cry, and backed off without hesitation. However, no matter how one moved in heaven and earth, they were all under the sky. How could they escape from it? Thousands of faint lines appeared in the blue sky. Each line was Lien Sanue's fist. In a few seconds, she had struck more than 3,000 fists. Ko Qingtong was indeed the only surviving swordsman of the Bloody Demon Church. He could still defend himself when facing such a violent attack. Yet, it was useless to defend himself. As Lien Sanue said, her opponent couldn't fight back as long as she struck for real. The secret method of the Bloody Demon Church was defeated. The magic method of the Zhongzhou school was dispersed. Ko Qingtong had employed all of the cultivation he had accumulated in the past 1,000 years in a very short time. Many lost secret methods and special methods appeared one after another, but they were of no use to him. It was because he couldn't block those fists coming down from the sky. A loud bang resounded. Lien Sanue's fist drew a line in the blue sky, as if a divine dragon was drawn out from the sky, crashing down toward Ko Qingtong's head. Ko Qingtong spat out a mouthful of blood, and his energy increased abruptly. He blocked the incoming fist with his palms. Crack! He knelt down on one knee. His knee, which was as hard as a magic treasure, broke into pieces instantly. The ground cracked open as well, forming a spider web with a radius of 1,000 feet. Time had stopped at this moment. The sound had also disappeared. No matter whether it was the trembling eunuchs on the other side of the palace wall and the pale-faced secret guards, or the chancellors in the grand hall with a grave expression, they all maintained their original postures, motionless. It was the difference in the speed of time caused by the difference in speed. Lien Sanue spun her head around to look at Jingjiu, flashing a childlike smile, as she thought that Jingjiu couldn't catch up to her at the moment. Then, she turned her head around and looked at Ko Qingtong. The smile on her face faded away, as if she was looking at a dead man. She clenched her fist and punched at him again. Ko Qingtong's cultivation state was exceedingly high. He could still move when everything in the royal palace was in a stagnant state. Yet, he was still a bit slow. He had just pulled back his hands from the top of his head, so he didn't have enough time to put them in front of his body. Seeing the fist coming closer and closer, a hint of anger and helplessness showed in his eyes. Ko Qingtong was sent flying again. It was the same as last time. It was simple. It was like everything in the mortal world. Even the route was the same. It was the same ditch, and he flew out from the breach on the palace wall. This way, he could at least save some money when the royal palace was rebuilt in the future. The Intian gate, which had one corner of the gate collapsed slowly, was hit by his body again, falling down with a loud boom. Ko Qingtong didn't stop this time. He kept flying southward. He didn't stop until he crashed heavily into the city wall after flying a long distance. A large hole was created on the city wall, exposing the space inside. The officials of the Pure Heaven Bureau, who were maintaining the forbidding formation, looked in this direction in bewilderment, their expressions changing slightly. Ko Qingtong was lying among the broken rocks on the ground. His body was badly deformed and covered in blood, some glowing specks in the blood, his eyes unfocused. Yet, he was indeed very formidable. He didn't turn into the glowing specks and die right away even though he was wounded so severely. A huge shadow enshrouded the city wall. 3 valley masters of Zhongzhou school arrived with the wind. Nobody is allowed to move, Otherwise we'll kill you, they yelled sternly while looking at the people in the forbidding formation. They approached the ruins, to bring Ko Ching-tong back to the cloud boat. It was then that the sound of a flute rang out. The sound of the flute was as melodious as the flowing water, like the reflection of the willow branches on the surface of the water, full of lethal intent. Chapter 6:16. As the smoke and dust settled, the view became clearer. The palace walls in the distance were in a similar state, with the layers of the walls peeling off and full of holes, looking like a relic from tens of thousands of years ago. The palace wall in the south was in the worst state, with a large breach about 100 feet wide. Lien Sanyue pulled back her fist. Everybody fixed their gazes on her fist, and then fixed their gazes on her face, full of awe and fear. Her movements couldn't be considered beautiful. They were very ordinary, just like her. Yet, those who had witnessed the earlier fight couldn't say that her movements were ordinary. Everybody knew that Lien Sanyue was the most powerful figure in the cultivation world, but few of them had seen her fight. It was because she hadn't fought for many years, and those who had seen her fight many years ago were mostly dead. It wasn't until that day that people learned that she was actually so powerful and formidable, even more so than what was rumored to be. Ko Ching-tong, the last swordsman of the Bloody Demon Church, had been beaten so badly by her. Jing Jiu was well aware of what kind of person she was, and it was expected that she could defeat Ko Ching-tong. As such, he remained calm, though a hint of worry could be seen at the bottom of his eyes. The Cloud Dream Mountain has a profound foundation, and any one of them is very powerful, but he's still a bit weak in my eyes, Lien Sanyue said to the Immortal Tan. No matter how dull the Immortal Tan was, he couldn't help but let out a bitter smile, saying, I didn't pick him randomly. No matter how profound the Cloud Dream Mountain was, they had only one formidable swordsman like Ko Ching-tong. But he's not as strong as you, said Lien Sanyue, while staring into the Immortal Tan's eyes, so I'm going to beat you. The Aoyama sect and the Zhongzhou school had agreed to have 5 fights, and the winner could continue the fight. Lien Sanyue had won the first fight, so she was qualified to fight the second. Yet, nobody expected that she would challenge the Immortal Tan right after she had defeated a swordsman like Ko Ching-tong. It grew quiet again in the royal palace. Nobody thought she would win this time. The Immortal Tan was the strongest swordsman in Chaotian, and Lien Sanyue had said that even Ko Ching-tong was not as strong as him. No matter how strong Lien Sanyue was, she had just defeated Ko Ching-tong, so she must have consumed a great deal of energy, and it was obvious that she was wounded. How could she defeat the Immortal Tan? Unexpectedly, the Immortal Tan didn't refuse her like he did to Jingjiu. Please, he said calmly. Looking at him, Lien Sanyue revealed an appreciative expression in her eyes as she said, As I said, you're a decent person, so I let you strike first. She had told Ko Ching-tong earlier that nobody would have a chance to strike if she struck first. Was it possible that the Immortal Tan was no exception? The Immortal Tan didn't feel humiliated at all. He started preparing himself earnestly. He reached out his hands in front of his body and started adjusting the distance and angle. His expression was really very serious, like a farmer who was preparing to plow the fields and a general who was preparing to go to war. He was meticulous and didn't mind the complexity. After a while, his hands stopped moving. They were about 1.5 feet apart, and his fingers were slightly spread open, as if he was hugging a void. After making sure that everything was perfect, the Immortal Tan lifted his head and said to Lien Sanyue, All right. Lien Sanyue suddenly laughed out. She asked the Immortal Tan to strike, and the Immortal Tan did so with only a pair of hands. How indifferent, how proud. This was the demeanor of the head of Zhongzhou school. Yet Lien Sanyue didn't want to strike first, and it was very difficult for her to strike when facing those hands. The Immortal Tan's hands were not simple. The void grasped by his hands gave her the feeling that it was another space, exuding a profound and dangerous intent. Lien Sanyue started calculating while looking at those hands in silence. The immortal Tan didn't move, letting her look at them as she wished. Time passed slowly. The morning sunlight returned to the sky above Zhaoga City. It was still quiet in the royal palace. Everybody was watching the scene nervously, as they were aware that it was not a simple confrontation. It was just that the immortal Tan and Lien Sanyue's cultivation states were too high for them to understand. A yawning sound suddenly broke out in the side hall. Ping Yongka felt bored, asking, "When will it start?" Many people in the quiet royal palace had heard what he said, glaring at each other angrily. Lien Sanwe heard what he said as well. She smiled faintly and flicked a drop of water toward the other side with her index finger. The drop of water flew over a distance of 1 mile and landed squarely between the hands of the immortal Tan. The ripples suddenly appeared in the patch of void, as if it had turned into the surface of a lake. Lien Sanwe didn't strike first. The immortal Tan didn't strike. Yet, the fight between the strongest swordsmen in Chaotian had begun. The surface of the lake had gradually calmed down, and the ripples grew wider, forming a few arcs of light. When the waves were rolling, the lake was a lake and the river was a river, but it would become a mirror when it calmed down. It was then that the space between the hands of the immortal Tan turned into a mirror, with a few arcs of light on it. The smallest mirror could accommodate the widest sky, as long as the distance was far enough or the magic method was powerful enough. The whole of the royal palace had entered the mirror, and then it was divided into different scenes by the arcs of light. The scenes intertwined, overlapped, and separated once in a while, but they were no longer one entity. The real world had also undergone a change. The group of palace halls seemed to have been cut into a few pieces, looking eerie and dazzling. Some courageous and curious eunuchs couldn't stand it any longer after taking a few glances at the scenes and passed out. Some chancellors in the grand hall sat down on the ground while covering their foreheads with their hands. The swordsmen of the cultivation sects in the sky felt their Dao hearts disturbed when they saw the scenes from the side, so they turned their heads around hastily. Buqiuxiao ordered Lu Shisui, Shi Yun and other regular disciples to close their eyes, and then he looked at the square, praising the immortal Tan again, thinking that the immortal Tan was indeed unparalleled in the world in terms of magic methods. As the immortal Tan's hands drew close to each other, the patch of void changed shape and became distorted. The two palaces in the two scenes drew close to each other. An unimaginably powerful force appeared in the square along with the overlapping of the space. Countless crisp, cracking sounds rang out in the quiet royal palace, which could be the sound of the space being cut apart or the sound of the broken pieces of space being destroyed. A great amount of chaotic wind gushed out from the cracks and cracks, passing through the square. If it weren't for the protection of the great formation of the royal palace, the palace walls would have been destroyed instantly. Lien Sanyue's black hair tousled, her face pale, a trickle of fresh blood seeping out from the corner of her mouth. Lien Sanyue had sustained a minor injury during the fight with Ko Qingtong. Now that she was squeezed by the space, her injury became more serious. If she wished to win this fight, she had to use the most brutal attack to interrupt the immortal Tan's magic method. However, the immortal Tan was also the person in the mirror even though he was the holder of the mirror. It was impossible for her to determine where his real body was in the space, so how could she attack him? Lien Sanwe took a step forward and found a passageway among the mirrors in the sky. The passageway didn't lead to the immortal Tan's real body, but to the morning sun in the sky. She didn't intend to fly away, all she wanted to do was look at the sun. A beam of morning sunlight arrived from the east, passing through the broken pieces of space in the royal palace, and landed squarely on her. Her figure looked exceedingly tall amid the beautiful morning sunlight. She reached out her right hand to grab the beam of morning sunlight, and then clenched it forcefully. An indescribable sound rang out in her palm. It sounded like a zither string breaking, or a flying sword breaking, or a magic treasure breaking apart. The morning sunlight was broken. Lien Sanwei didn't loosen her grip. The morning sunlight refracted and collided with each other in her palm. In the end, it seeped out from the cracks between her fingers and turned into tiny particles, scattering in all directions. The mirrors in the space in the royal palace were occupied by the tiny particles of morning sunlight at the same time. All of them turned white instantly, looking like countless pieces of paper. It was a marvelous scene. "Open!" Lien Sanwei yelled as she tossed the piece of morning sunlight to the ground. The milky white light particles rolled on the ground like the ocean's spray or the fog. In the meantime, the light particles in the mirrors in the space began to collide with the edges of the mirrors, giving off crackling sounds like the rainstorm. It was unclear whether it was because the edges of the mirrors were on the verge of collapsing or because of the strong attraction between the particles of morning sunlight, but the mirrors in the space had gradually moved closer to each other, and the group of palace halls had gradually returned to their original appearance. There was a pagoda in the royal garden in the west of the royal palace, but it was in the sky above. As Lien Sanwei did it, the pagoda drifted toward the royal garden in the west slowly. It was then that the immortal Tan walked out from the pagoda. Chapter 6:17. In many people's eyes, the immortal Tan had been standing in the same spot in the square the entire time. It wasn't until he walked out from the pagoda that the people realized that he had left a long time ago, and he was already 1,000 feet away from Lien Sanwei. The immortal Tan held a small ancient bell in his right hand. It is not the flowing light clock used by Lo Huainan and by Zhao, but the most powerful magic weapon of Zhongzhou school, scenic cloud clock. "Fall!" Lien Sanwei yelled. A ray of morning sunlight descended from the sky, heading toward the top of the immortal Tan's head. With a light hum, the scenic cloud bell blocked the morning light that contained the might of heaven and earth. The low chime it emitted easily destroyed several ancient trees in the sky. The immortal Tan disappeared without a trace again. In the next moment, he walked out from a side room in the western sky. This was the power of the scenic cloud bell. This was the wrong step of heaven and earth. The scenic cloud bell was a very special magic treasure. It was said to be a natural divine object that hung on the neck of a Qilin in ancient times. It was as heavy as a mountain and could not be used through the air like flying swords and other magic treasures. It could only be used by the holder of the bell. No matter how profound a cultivator's realm was, even if it was an exiled immortal, as long as the scenic cloud bell rang in their ears, their souls would scatter and they would be in so much pain that they wished they were dead. Even if they were lucky enough to survive, they would definitely be unable to resist at all. Of course, ordinary cultivators could not even pick up the scenic cloud bell, much less use it. Only a swordsman like the immortal Tan could hold it in his hand casually and walk freely. It was like when Jingjiu walked toward Lien Sanwei. If it were any other cultivation practitioner, they wouldn't be able to ascertain the location of the immortal Tan. They would have no choice but to break open the space mirror and flee as soon as possible. Yet, Lien Sanwei didn't take a step back. She looked at the immortal Tan in the sky, the fighting intent in her eyes growing stronger and her eyes brighter. An unimaginably violent aura seeped out from her clothes. The sun in the east seemed to have sensed her will and shone even more morning light. The morning light fell one by one, as if it had been sifted through by the dense branches. No matter where the immortal Tan came from, he was greeted by a ray of morning sunlight, which prevented him from reaching the front of Lien Sanwei. How could Lien Sanwei predict his position in advance? Why was she able to see the only truth among so many falsehoods? The experts from the various sects who could still see the scene on the square fell silent and guessed the reason. This was Shui Yu Nunnery's heaven-man connection. There was a soft sound. An extremely beautiful ray of morning light came from the east. The immortal Tan walked out from the grand hall in the sky. The two met. The morning light brushed past his body. A section of his sleeves and the front of his lapel were reduced to ashes, but it did not stop him from taking the most crucial step. The immortal Tan had finally arrived in front of Lien Sanue. The two of them were only about 100 feet apart. In a battle of this level, this was an extremely rare occurrence. Yet, the immortal Tan came so naturally. Lien Sanue was also watching them casually. The immortal Tan took another step forward and raised his left hand along with a few gusts of gentle wind. He was ready to ring the scenic cloud bell in his right hand. Unexpectedly, Lien Sanue didn't leave, nor did she launch another attack with the fist of the morning light. Instead, she folded her hands behind her back. She leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to sprint. A flash of light appeared at the end of her tousling black hair. In the next moment, a flash of light also appeared at the crook of her clothes. A flash of light appeared on her neckline, the soles of her shoes, the corners of her lips, and many other parts of her body. These were not sword wills, and she was not a shapeless sword body, but they could be connected to each other. She and Jingjiu had traveled together in the world for many years at the 3000 nunnery, and she had become a grandmaster in the sword work. Countless beams of light gathered together and formed a light screen. Her body was at the front of the light screen. It seemed that those beams of light were the residual shadows left by her. She accelerated her speed to an extreme and dashed toward the immortal Tan. There was a soft clank sound. She brushed past him. Heaven and earth mismatched step. She would be at the end of the world if she took a wrong step. The broken pieces of the light mirror in the square suddenly grew dimmer, and the groups of palaces that had appeared in different places suddenly turned around. Whoosh! The scenic cloud bell was rung. The violent wind whipped up, and the sky and earth turned dark. The whole royal palace seemed to be quaking at the moment. Nobody could see the scene clearly, not even Zen Master and Buqiuxiao. After a long while, the beams of light had finally disappeared, and the royal palace returned to its normal state. There were only two people left in the square, standing back to back with a distance of 100 feet between them. Lien Sanue raised her left sleeve to wipe off the blood on her face, but more blood came out from her nose and mouth. She couldn't wipe it off no matter how hard she tried. Looking at the scenic cloud bell in his hand, the wrinkles on the immortal Tan's face grew deeper, and his cotton cloth was covered with the traces of being burned by the morning sunlight. He looked a bit terrible. Pa! Pa! Countless crisp sounds rang out. Some of them came from the broken pieces of the space, but most of them came from the immortal Tan's body. "I've lost," said the immortal Tan while turning around and looking at her. His expression was still dull. Lien Sanue turned around and said to him, "If you insisted on knocking the bell one more time, you might die with me." Her face was full of blood and dirt. She didn't look like an otherworldly swordsman Shueyu nunnery at all, but more like a naughty girl who had fought with her neighbor's boy. The immortal Tan said, "I don't want to die, and I have many things to do." Lien Sanue said after some thought, "I don't have anything to do. So it's understandable that I lost to you." Looking at her right hand, the immortal Tan continued sentimentally, "Moreover, the number of Zhen Yuan you have is among the top 3 in the history of the cultivation world. Who in Chaotian can be your match?" Lien Sanue was still bleeding. She wiped the blood with her left sleeve from time to time, but her right hand didn't move. The morning sunlight seeped out from the gaps between her fingers. A faint golden speck could be seen in the white sunlight, which could only be seen by Lien Sanue and the immortal Tan. Lien Sanue said, "It's also part of the fortune of Cloud Dream Mountain. So I'm happy about it." Having said that, the immortal Tan leapt up into the air and headed toward Cloud Dream Mountain. It was quiet in the royal palace for a long time. Everybody was shocked to the extreme. The immortal Tan had lost, and he claimed that nobody in all of Chaotian was a match for Lien Sanue. She had first defeated Ko Qintong, the last swordsman of the Bloody Demon Church, and then defeated the immortal Tan, the sect master of Zhongzhou School, who was widely regarded as the strongest swordsman in the world, without any rest. How powerful was this woman? Why did the immortal Tan leave Zhaoga City? Did he choose to give up because he thought the Zhongzhou school had lost 2 matches in a row and nobody could defeat Lien Sanyue? Lien Sanyue fought Ko Qingtong first, and then the immortal Tan. The sands and pebbles were flying in the air, and the morning sunlight and the sky had all descended to the human world. Nobody noticed that Jing Xian came to the front of the grand hall along the palace wall and was protected by those old chancellors who were still loyal to him. Seeing the immortal Tan treading on the air and leaving Zhaoga City, Jing Xian didn't feel sad or disappointed when he knelt down in the Shuiyu nunnery. On the contrary, he felt relieved. It was then that Jing Yao noticed that his elder brother was not far away. The 2 brothers stared at each other, feeling a bit nonchalant and then getting nervous. It was because Lien Sanyue was walking toward the grand hall. Both the brothers of the Jing royal family and the chancellors in the imperial court grew nervous reflexively when they saw Lien Sanyue approaching them. Duke Lu and the others were no exception. Nobody could remain calm when facing her after witnessing what had happened that day. Lien Sanyue didn't pay any attention to these people, walking toward Jingjiu. She suddenly stopped halfway and grabbed some clean water from the air to wash off the blood stains on her face before she resumed walking. Lien Sanyue walked past Jingjiu and sat down on the stone step. Jingjiu walked back to her and sat down by her side, looking at her profile. The peach blossom was still quivering slightly in her hair. It looked even more beautiful after being stained with blood. Chapter 6:18. You're still as clingy as ever, said Lien Sanyue while shooting a glance at Jing Xian. Why didn't you just kill him back then? Clingy was the evaluation of the Aoyama sect for the Zhongzhou school, but it was also her evaluation of the entire cultivation circle in Chaotian. It was hard for Jingjiu to comment on it. Lien Sanyue's voice was not loud, but everybody in the grand hall had been paying attention to her every move, so they heard her clearly. Jing Xian remained silent, his face pale. It's useless to kill him, said Jingjiu. Do you remember Jing Shu? There are many descendants of the royal family scattered among the people like her. The Zhongzhou school could pick one of them at any time and let Yamatsai raise her. I believe Buqiuxiao wouldn't mind. I remember that little girl. The Jing family is indeed fertile, said Lien Sanyue. She's dead, but you can't, said Jingjiu. What would you do if I didn't wake up? Asked Lien Sanyue. It wasn't until now that the Aoyama sect hadn't sent anyone here, and neither had Yuan Qijing. She knew the true relationship between Jingjiu and Yuan Qijing, so she knew it was his idea to do so. I thought I could handle it myself, said Jingjiu. Lien Sanyue shot him a disdainful glance. You're so weak now. How can you handle it? Jingjiu said calmly, It's the first time you're qualified to say that I'm weak in the last several hundred years. Lien Sanyue arched her eyebrows slightly and said contentedly, You're weaker than me anyway. Jingjiu said with a smile, I have a way to deal with him no matter how weak he is. The expression on Lien Sanyue's face changed a bit as she asked, Which method are you going to use? Many people will die. Do you care about the death of many people? Asked Jingjiu with a slightly changed expression. Maybe I'm influenced by you, said Lien Sanyue. I'm also influenced by you, said Jingjiu. What's the point of telling me what I like to hear now? Lien Sanyue leaned back with a smile. She looked up at the blue sky with her hands on the steps behind her, seeming to enjoy the moment. After a moment of silence, Jingjiu said, Thank you. Lien Sanyue said while still looking at the sky, I'm not a regular girl, but I know you don't have a sweet tongue. Don't force yourself to say such things in the future, it's too stiff. As Jingjiu was about to say something else, the sound of the teacups colliding with each other suddenly came from behind the 2 of them. It sounded like the chattering of teeth, full of fear. The 2 of them turned around and saw Ping Yongka standing on the stone steps with a tray in his hands. There were 2 teacups on the plate. The teacups were made of white porcelain, but they were not as white as his face. Ping Yongka was really scared at this time because he found that he had heard a lot of things that he shouldn't have heard. He didn't know if he would be killed to keep his mouth shut. Even if her teacher was protecting her, this woman was too powerful. Furthermore, she had just said that her teacher was weaker than her, speaking of which, there was indeed something fishy going on between his master and this woman. He had already gotten so close to her, yet he had not realized it. Were the two of them only thinking about each other? I really regret it. What am I doing here? It's not worth it to sacrifice my life to please my teacher. Thinking of all this, Ping Yongka's face grew paler and paler, and his body trembled more violently. The sound of the teacups clinking against each other and his teeth chattering sounded like someone playing a zither. "Who is this idiot?" asked Lien Sanyue curiously. "My disciple, the one who closed the door," replied Jingjiu. Lien Sanyue shot a glance at Ping Yongka, but she didn't find anything special about him. She took the teacup and had a sip of it, saying, "I'm a bit thirsty now. Thank you." Hearing this, Ping Yongka felt overjoyed, thinking that he was not going to die. It was then that Lien Sanyue shot him another glance. Ping Yongka's joy vanished abruptly, his entire body turning cold, as if he had fallen into an icehouse. He thought that such a figure was probably temperamental and wouldn't strike him to death all of a sudden. A moment later, Lien Sanyue shot him another glance. Ping Yongka was scared out of his wits. "What have you found out?" asked Jingjiu. "Nothing," said Lien Sanyue. "Me neither," said Jingjiu. "So it's a bit strange." A large hole had been created on the southeastern section of the city wall, and the broken stones piled up into a small hill. Lying on the hill, Ko Qingtong was covered in blood, his eyes looking at the sky blankly. The forbidding formation at the bottom of the city wall was exposed to the sunlight. Gu Pan and the officials of the Pure Heaven Bureau were watching the outside cautiously. Dozens of air waves were approaching at a high speed. The 3 valley masters of the Zhongzhou school were in the front, all of whom were swordsmen in the Lianshu state. It was evident that the Zhongzhou school didn't want Ko Qingtong to die so easily. All of a sudden, a melodious sound of flute broke out. The 3 valley masters stopped at the foot of the ruins and looked around cautiously, but they didn't discover anything. The sound of flute could be heard clearly by everybody's ears. It was both gentle and dreadful. Gu Pan's face was ashen. He raised his hand to signal his subordinates to get ready for the fight. The divine crossbow hidden in the stone wall of the high platform had been pushed out, aiming at the outside. The sound of flute drifted in the early morning wind. It was unclear where it originated from, but it could be heard everywhere, including the spot above the ruins and by Ko Qingtong's ear. All of a sudden, a small shapeless sword came out from the sound of flute and entered Ko Qingtong's left ear as fast as lightning, and then came out from his right ear with a faint whoosh. A few drops of sticky blood dripped down from Ko Qingtong's ear and were set ablaze after falling on the broken stones, turning into green smoke and vanishing into nothingness. The expression in Ko Qingtong's eyes dimmed slightly, and his body started to wither visibly. In the end, he turned into countless withered leaves and vanished along with the wind. This swordsman had been cultivating in the back mountain of Cloud Dream Mountain for 1,000 years. He came out of the mountain for the sake of a fairy book, but he died in such a way. He was the last swordsman of the Bloody Demon Church, and also the last swordsman of the last age. His death marked the end of the history of the Bloody Demon Church. Did it mean that the Bloody Demon Church had left the stage of history for 1,000 years? After the shapeless small sword had killed Ko Qingtong, it vanished in the wind, and the crisp sound of flute faded away. All the people who witnessed the scene were shocked speechless. Ko Qingtong was one of the strongest swordsmen in Chaotian. Even though he was severely wounded by Lien Sanyue and on the verge of death, how could he be killed so easily? Moreover, the 3 swordsmen in the Lianshu state didn't even notice the arrival of this small sword. Who was the owner of the flute and this small sword? The 3 valley masters of Zhongzhou school chased after the source of the flute, and they didn't take a look at the forbidding formation at the foot of the city wall. Gu Pan felt relieved even though his face was still pale. He waved his hands in front of his body, and his energy came out swiftly. He employed the magic method of Zhongzhou school to move the bricks and stones to block the hole on the city wall, and then he ordered his subordinates to reinforce the formation. The sound of the flute kept on drifting in Zhaoga City. It was sometimes melodious, sometimes playful, sometimes soothing, and sometimes complacent. The location of the flute kept on changing. It was at Taichung Temple one moment, then at the White Horse Lake the next moment, then at the Plum Garden the next moment, and then by a well a few miles away. The flute appeared and disappeared mysteriously. The 3 valley masters of Zhongzhou school encountered Yu Qianmen after chasing after the flute for a while. The 2 of them were certain that they were looking for the Demon King, the expressions in their eyes growing more grave. The Demon King Taiping had cultivated again, and his cultivation state was still low, but why couldn't these 4 elders in the Lianshu state catch up with him? It was impossible for them to surround and kill him. By the time Yu Qianmen and the other 3 swordsmen of Zhongzhou school encountered him, Yin San had already fetched a pot of water from the well and came to a restaurant. This restaurant was not too far away from the royal palace, and only a few miles away from the Intian Gate. It should be a popular place for the high officials and nobles. The furnishings here were exquisite, and the view from the railing was perfect. Yin San found the most expensive green tea in the storeroom. He poured some tea into the teacup, and then came to the railing with the kettle and the teacup, looking out of the restaurant. The kettle of water was the one he had just fetched from the well. As he poured it into the teacup, it was extremely hot, giving off white smoke. It took only a moment for the tea to be washed away, exuding a faint aroma of tea. Yin San brought the teacup to his lips and blew on it. The hot tea cooled down a lot, but it was at a suitable temperature for drinking. The new tea entered his throat, like the sound of the flute in his ears. He sighed contentedly. Looking at the Intian Gate a few miles away, he raised his beautiful eyebrows. The Intian Gate had become a ruin, but the mass of cloud and fog was still there. The figure in the cloud and fog was intermittently visible, but he still couldn't see it clearly. With a fluttering sound, the blue bird flew over from afar and landed on the railing. She followed his line of sight, and her pupils trembled slightly, showing that she was very uneasy. The blue bird spoke the human language. "What are you doing?" She had lived in Zhongzhou school for tens of thousands of years and been controlled by Baizhenren for hundreds of years, so she knew better than anyone else how formidable Baizhenren was. Holding the teacup, Yin San looked at the mass of cloud and fog in silence. He didn't say anything, nor did he intend to withdraw his line of sight. Qing turned back to her human form and asked nervously while looking at him, "Are you provoking her?" "I'm testing her," Yin San said. Given Baizhenren's cultivation state, she must have sensed his line of sight immediately, but she didn't pay any attention to him. What kind of event could make her ignore Taipingzhenren for the time being? It must be something more important than heaven, or something more important than all of Chaotian. "What's the matter?" asked Qing. Yin San said thoughtfully, "Someone might die today." Qing snapped, "But it won't be you." This time, Yin San didn't respond with, "Of course," like he usually would. After a long moment of silence, he turned his head to look at the royal palace in the north, a regretful expression showing in his eyes. Back then, he thought that Lian Sanyue was the most similar person to him. Though their ideas were different, they were essentially the same person. It was a pity that such an outstanding woman had been harmed by that blockhead young brother and turned into what she had become. He picked up the teacup and took a sip, saying sentimentally, "Women, what's wrong with women?" Qing asked with raised eyebrows. The officials in the Grand Hall and the cultivation practitioners of various sects in the sky had gradually come to their senses and accepted the reality. The reality was that Shui Yu Nunnery and Lien Sanyue had suddenly appeared in the human world and fought on behalf of Aoyama, defeating two powerful swordsmen of Zhongzhou school in a row. Looking at the young man and woman drinking tea on the stone steps in front of the grand hall, the people had an odd feeling in their hearts. If Jing Jiu was indeed Jingyang, and they had become cultivation partners back then, nobody else in Chaotian would have a chance. 2 of the 5 fights between the Aoyama sect and Zhongzhou school had ended. If Zhongzhou school lost another fight, they would have to leave Zhaoga City according to the agreement and stop interfering in the fight for the throne. It seemed that Zhongzhou school was in a precarious situation and was on the edge of the cliff, but nobody thought that Zhongzhou school had no hope. No matter how strong Lien Sanyue was, she must have consumed a great deal of energy after defeating 2 powerful swordsmen in a row, and everybody could tell that she was severely wounded. Some of the wounds were caused by Ko Qingtong, and some were caused by her breaking through the broken space by forcibly increasing her cultivation state. The most severe wound was caused by the scenic cloud bell that the immortal Tan had rung. The divine crossbow couldn't even penetrate the cloth of the female cultivation practitioner of the Dongyi Daoist sect. The Zhongzhou school would fight next, no matter whether it was by Zhenren or the unicorn, but Lien Sanyue wouldn't be able to defend against them. The patch of cloud and fog left the ruins of the Intian Gate and arrived in the royal palace. It landed in the square and then dispersed gradually. Seeing this, the people felt a bit nervous, but they also thought it was reasonable. The long cry of the unicorn didn't break out in the distance. The third fight of the Zhongzhou school should be fought by Zhenren. As the cloud and fog dispersed, a figure appeared. Her face was still shrouded in fog, and her body was as tall as a snowy mountain. A barrage of surprised screams broke out around the royal palace. A person walked out from behind her. There were 2 people in the cloud and fog the entire time. The woman walked toward the square in silence, her white skirt tousling. He was none other than Bai Zhao. Chapter 6:19. Bai Zhao wore a curtained hat with a white veil hanging down from the brim of the hat, covering her face slightly. A white ribbon passed through her arm, drifting behind her as it rose up with the wind. Looking from a distance, she looked like a fairy lady in white. Her feeble and peaceful energy was like the lake water, like the willow branch, like the reflection of the willow branch on the surface of the lake. The whole cultivation circle knew that she was the precious daughter of the sect master and his wife of the Zhongzhou school. She was born intelligent and resourceful, and her talent in cultivation was also very high. However, her talent in cultivation was not very promising because of her inborn deficiency. For some reason, she and Jingjiu were all cured after being trapped in the snowland for 6 years in the cultivation tournament of the Plum Meeting. Since then, her talent in cultivation had been fully demonstrated. She and Tong Yen were the only 2 people on the Cloud Dream Mountain who could be compared to Zhao Liu and Zhuo Ruzhui of the Aoyama sect. However, no matter how talented she was in cultivation, why did she appear in the square of the royal palace and walk toward the grand hall? Seeing this scene, the cultivation practitioners suddenly thought of a possibility, feeling shocked speechless, wondering if she would be the 3rd person of the Zhongzhou school. How could it be possible? A cultivation practitioner in the Yuanying state participating in a contest of such a high level was no different from seeking death. Even the immortal Tan and Ko Qingtong had been defeated by Lien Sanyue. How could she defeat her? Even if Lien Sanyue didn't participate in the contest, it was impossible for her to defeat the other swordsmen of the Aoyama sect. Bai Zhao walked over slowly, the morning wind ruffling the hem of her skirt and the white satin. The expression on Jingjiu's face was grave. He knew that she would be the 3rd opponent of the Aoyama sect that day, and also the strongest one. The expression in Lien Sanyue's eyes was a bit cold. "You shouldn't have taught my magic method to her," she said to Jingjiu. Jingjiu said, "Since it started because of me, let me fight this one." Ping Yongka listened behind the two of them and could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. He thought to himself, "Master, you can't be so excessive even if you want to take advantage of others, right? You didn't hit the strange man in green when he came, you didn't make a sound when the immortal Tan came, but you wanted to go out when a weak little girl came. Maybe I can do it after a few more years of practice. Moreover, everybody on the Shima Peak knows the relationship between you and that little girl. Would she have the heart to hit you?" It was natural that Lien Sanyue didn't agree with Jingjiu's opinion, though her reasons sounded a bit odd. "You're too weak now. Even if you use that move, you might not be her match." Ping Yongka sucked in a mouthful of cold air soundlessly once more. He imitated senior brother Yuan Chu and scratched his head speechlessly, thinking, is there a need to be so cautious? Furthermore, she was worried that her master could not defeat her? Jingjiu, on the other hand, showed a rare firmness. He even seemed a little stubborn as he said, "This is my business." Yet, Lien Sanyue was more insistent than Jingjiu, asking, "Should we have a fight first?" "Okay," replied Jingjiu, refusing to back down. After a moment of silence, Lien Sanyue said, "Forget it then. You go ahead." Jingjiu got up from the stone steps and headed toward the square. All of a sudden, a bright morning sunlight shone down from the sky, enshrouding him. Jingjiu raised his right hand without hesitation and wielded it toward the morning sunlight. It was well known that he usually used the sword of the universe, the first child sword, or the thoughtless sword, and he would only use his right hand at the critical moment. It meant that he had determined immediately that he had to exert his full strength. What was it that made him so anxious? It was difficult to cut the water with a sword, but Ping Yongka had done it. Few people in this world could cut the morning sunlight with a sword. Jingjiu might be able to do it, but he couldn't cut off this morning sunlight. It was because Lien Sanyue had borrowed this morning sunlight from the morning sun by employing the heaven-human connection. The more troublesome part was that the morning sunlight had countless ripples, which looked like small circles, locking Jingjiu's sword wills inside. Along with a series of tapping sounds, Lien Sanyue's finger passed through Jingjiu's black hair and landed on his damaged earlobe, a circular light wave rising from the tip of her finger. Jingjiu couldn't move an inch after being bound by the light. "I've been asleep for so many years, but I still have a dream once in a while. I dream of the quiet room at the 3000 nunnery and the round window outside the room, where I have comprehended a magic method." Lien Sanyue walked to the front of Jingjiu and said to him while turning around, "I want to call it the pleasant night. What do you think?" It was a peaceful and pleasant time when Jingjiu stayed at the 3000 nunnery. The young masterly often came here to play zither to the horses, and the song he played the most was "The Pleasant Night." It was unclear if she was asking about Jingjiu's opinion of the name or the magic method. Jingjiu didn't say anything. All he did was look at her in silence. Lien Sanyue said with raised eyebrows, "Give up? You won't use that move anyway." If he used that move, the result would be either her death or his. "You can't defeat her," said Jingjiu while looking at her in silence. Lien Sanyue said with a faint smile, "You'll never be able to defeat me in this lifetime. So I'll do it myself." It was the same as in her previous life. She would never be able to defeat him even if she didn't cry. Having said that, she plucked the peach flower from her temple and inserted it into his ear. "It looks good," she said satisfactorily after looking at it for a while. Recalling what Nan Wang said in Scenery Garden, Jingjiu asked, "Didn't you feel it was strange at first?" "I'm talking about this flower," said Lien Sanyue shyly. This peach flower looked good even though it was stained with blood and had a petal missing. Your face changed because of the missing part of your ear, but it still looked good. Seeing Lien Sanyue walking toward the square, Jingjiu didn't say anything more. As Ping Yongka walked to the foot of the stone steps, he was about to say something to Jingjiu, but he stopped reflexively when he saw Jingjiu's face. Why did his master's expression look so sad? It was as if he was bidding farewell to someone and would never see that person again. Ping Yongka suddenly felt sad as well, tears welling up in his eyes. "Help me," said Jingju all of a sudden. Ping Yongka thought he had heard it wrong. He didn't come back to his senses until he heard Jingju repeat the words, "Help me." "How can I help you?" he asked hastily. Jingju said, "Gather all of your sword source and temper your body by reversing the will of the sword, forcing the will of the sword out for me." "How much do you need?" asked Ping Yongka. "All of it," said Jingju. For a swordsman, it was extremely dangerous to force the will of the sword out by reversing the sword's source, not to mention all of the will of the sword. Jingju knew that Ping Yongka would be safe, but Ping Yongka didn't. Yet, Jingju sat down on the ground without a second thought and started to activate the will of the sword with his eyes closed. When Lien Sanyue arrived in the middle of the square, Bai Zhao was still in the distance. The patch of cloud and fog in the distance had gathered again, enshrouding Bai Jinren, making her voice sound a bit faintly discernible. "It's a bit surprising that you're still alive, but you can't change anything," Lien Sanyue said expressionlessly. "The immortal Tan is actually not bad, but do you know why I don't like him?" Bai Jinren said, "People of our generation are all aware that you only have eyes for Jingyang. You don't even like Chao Yuan. How could you like someone as dull and boring as him?" "No," said Lien Sanyue. "I don't like him because he married someone like you in order to become the sect master of the Center sect." The immortal Bai pressed, "Where did your hostility toward me come from then?" "It's because of her, of course." Lien Sanyue waved her sleeve a few times. The wind in the square grew stronger, ruffling the ribbons on Bai Zhao's arms and the veil on the curtain hat, exposing her face. Bai Zhao's eyes were closed, her long eyelashes not blinking at all. Her face was ruddy, looking like a sleeping child. The eerie thing was that she was still walking forward. "I thought this child was extremely adorable the first time I saw her." Looking at Bai Jinren in the cloud and fog, Lien Sanyue said sternly, "As her mother, how could you do it?" She had said that she didn't want to talk to Bai Jinren that day, but seeing Bai Zhao show up, she couldn't suppress the anger in her heart any longer. She was determined to teach him a lesson. The patch of cloud and fog retreated from the royal palace. Bai Jinren didn't respond to her question. It suddenly rained in the sunny sky. It was the sun rain. It was also the sign of the strange phenomenon of heaven and earth. Countless dark clouds came over from all directions of the sky, blocking the sunlight instantly and making the world dark. Countless bolts of lightning could be vaguely seen amidst the clouds, ready to strike down at any moment. Bai Zhao flew to the high sky with his eyes closed, the white ribbons fluttering in the air, as if he was writing words that nobody could understand. The violent wind was howling, and the rainstorm was like arrows. The energy of heaven and earth was in chaos, as if the heavenly punishment was coming. Crack! Crack! Countless thunder boomed, and countless bolts of lightning struck down from the high sky, entering Bai Zhao's body. Some of the lightning bolts came from the clouds, and some from the thunder region. It seemed that some of them came from a higher place. Chapter 620. Innumerable flashes of lightning struck down from the dark clouds and entered Bai Zhao's body. This was a process of arrival. Lien Sanyue should try to interrupt this process, but she didn't. All she did was look at Bai Zhao at the bottom of the clouds in silence, her eyes devoid of wariness or disgust, only pity and affection. After her failure in ascension, she used the method of transforming the silkworm into the butterfly to experience the heavenly tribulation and come back to life. As a result, she felt a sense of urgency, so she started looking for a successor in the human world a long time ago. Lo Huainan, Tong Lu, Tong Yen, Hejan, and the talented young disciples who had participated in the plum meeting that year were all her targets. Bai Zhao was the focus of her attention. However, Baizeo was too weak at the time. She thought that this child couldn't withstand such a heavy pressure, so she turned her attention to Zhao Leu and went to the plum meeting. Zhao Leu was perfect in every aspect, but she went to the Shunma Peak and became the personal disciple of Jingyang. After hearing the news, Lian Sanwe knew that Zhao Leu wouldn't be her successor, not to mention that she had given up the idea after she learned that Jingjiu was Jingyang. It happened that Baizeo came back from the snowland at that time, and the hidden disease in his body was cured. His strong willpower under his weak appearance was fully demonstrated. Guodong chose Lian Sanwe without hesitation. Baizeo didn't disappoint her. When she was asleep, he and Tong Yen planned the scheme of the West Ocean and almost killed Tai Pingzhenren. It was true that Lian Sanwe and Baizeo didn't have the relationship of master and disciple. She had been asleep when Baizeo visited her in Shuiyu Nunnery over the last few years. In fact, they hadn't met each other more than a few times. Yet, they were the true master and disciple regardless of their ideals, methods, and ideas. Lian Sanwe regarded Baizeo as her true successor. She was such an adorable and sensible little girl, but she had become like this because of the schemes and ambitions of the Zhongzhou school and the Bai family. Lian Sanwe felt sorry for her. Accompanied by the rumbling thunder, countless lightning bolts entered Baizeo's body. Even a figure in the reaching heaven state would probably die on the spot when faced with such a bombardment, which was like a heavenly tribulation. Her eyes were closed, and she was still sleeping soundly. After an unknown amount of time, the lightning finally stopped, and the clouds became calm again. It looked like a thick gray carpet that covered the entire sky. She woke up and opened her eyes to look down at the royal palace, Zhaoga City, and the whole of Chaotian. Her eyes were not absolutely emotionless, but her emotions were extremely indifferent. For example, that extremely faint trace of nostalgia only needed to be blown away by the wind to disappear without a trace. This kind of calmness was not like water, but more like the wind. There was a sense of superiority that surpassed the entire world, as if a god was looking down on the mortal world. "You're not bad. Do you know why you still can't ascend?" Standing in the sky and looking at Lian Sanwe, Zhao Leu said calmly, "It's because your fighting will is too strong. You should know that heaven and man should communicate with each other instead of fighting each other." Her voice was very pleasant, like the spring water or the string and bamboo instruments, but it was not vulgar at all, sounding like the fairy music. Though such a pleasant voice sounded like the rumbling of thunder in the ears of the mortals, it was extremely dreadful. The eunuchs and servant girls behind the palace walls passed out one after another while covering their ears with their hands. The chancellors in the grand hall and the magic army outside the city walls felt dizzy, unable to stand still. Yamatsai's boat of diligent study retreated a few miles away from the royal palace, and the lotus cloud in the south grew fainter. The rest of the cultivation sects fled as far as they could. Her casual and gentle voice was unbearable in the human world, and even swordsmen like the young Zen master and Buqiuxiao had to distance themselves from her. It meant that her energy was so powerful that it was beyond the scope of the human world. Looking at the figure that looked like a black speck in the sky, the people thought of a possibility in shock. Was it possible that she was not Baizeo, but a fairy lady? A saint would appear every 1,000 years. This was a proverb in Chaotian. The saint here was not only Yamatsai, but also the ascendant. Those cultivation practitioners who had ascended and obtained the Tao were the fairy ladies. There had been a legend in Chaotian about a fairy lady coming back to the human world, but nobody had ever witnessed it. Yet, it was quite possible for it to happen in the Zhongzhou school. The ascendant 1,000 years ago was the fairy lady Bai Ren of the Zhongzhou school. She left a few fairy books for Cloud Dream Mountain before she left. Those fairy books had suppressed the king of the underworld and killed the immortal Lu Ci. It was not surprising that she had brought her back. The immortal Tan said that Lien Sanyue was the most powerful swordsman in Chaotian, but if the fairy lady Bai Ren had indeed come back, even if it was only a sliver of her spiritual awareness, the people in this world couldn't resist her. In fact, they couldn't resist her even if all the people in this world joined hands. A heartfelt awe and shock made everyone in Zhaoga City kneel down. It was the same as when the Snow Girl walked through the dark and gloomy passageway of the Sword Jail, and those demons and devils in the cells on both sides had to kneel down. This was the difference in the state of life, and it was the fear in the deepest part of life. It was truly overwhelming. All the people knelt down and bowed to the woman in white in the sky. The divine crossbows behind the palace walls and inside the city walls lowered their heads slowly, not daring to point at her. The assassins of Bulolin and the curtain rollers hiding in the dark in Zhaoga City sensed the formidable energy in the sky and didn't dare lift their heads. They knelt down on the ground, trembling all over. Standing in the passageway between the side hall and the grand hall, the royal concubine who clutched the flower lattice on the door tightly with her fingers. Her knuckles were pale, and her face was even paler. She was lying limply on the ground, her eyes full of fear. A piao was drifting around the beams above the side hall. Her leaf-like fringe was wet and messy due to the sweat. The mixed glows emitted from her small face indicated that she was in a more complicated mood and extremely scared state. The fairy lady Bai Ren had returned to Chaotian. It was quiet all over the world. Tens of thousands of people knelt down on the ground. Yet, a few people didn't kneel down. In the restaurant in Zhaoga City, In-san raised the teacup to his lips and took a sip. Looking at the fairy lady in white in the sky, he arched his eyebrows slightly. Hiding behind Jingjiu, Qing only dared expose her eyes to look at the sky, her eyes full of fear. She had lived on the Cloud Dream Mountain for tens of thousands of years. She had witnessed Bai Ren grow from a babbling infant to a talented genius in Chaotian in the end, and then ascend and become a fairy lady. She knew better than anybody else how powerful and formidable Bai Ren was, not to mention that Bai Ren had already ascended and become a fairy lady. She was many times more powerful than she was back then, perhaps 1,000 times or 10,000 times more powerful. She noticed that In-san didn't show any fear, and it wasn't an act. "That's a fairy lady," she yelled in bewilderment. "She's a true fairy lady." In-san pointed the teacup at the woman in white in the sky and said nonchalantly, "Fairy lady, you can only be called a fairy lady after you went out. Now that you're back, what kind of fairy are you?" Ping Yongka didn't kneel down. It was because he had no idea what had happened. Otherwise, he would be so shocked that he would curse the fairy lady or the ancestors. In this regard, he was more influenced by Zhuoruzhui and Yuan Chu. Sitting on the stone steps with his eyes closed, Jingjiu tried his best to reverse the flow of sword wills in his body and force them out. The gentle wind ruffled his cloth, bringing along the shapeless but substantial sword wills, drifting toward the morning sunlight like the catkins. Standing in the morning sunlight, Jingjiu didn't kneel down. He looked at the woman in white in the sky in silence and her eyes, as if he wanted to see the deepest part of her eyes. Countless tiny but extremely pure sword wills drifted over from outside the morning sunlight, but they were swallowed and dissolved by the circular light circles in the blink of an eye. Lien Sanyue's, a beautiful knight, was indeed formidable, but she couldn't stop them all. A few sword wills slipped through the net, because there were too many sword wills drifting over. A few strands of the morning sunlight had already been cut off. If all the strands were cut off, Jingjiu would be able to escape. By then, he would try to kill that fairy lady. He hadn't met Bai Ren, and he was sneak attacked by her the first time he met her after his ascension, but he knew how powerful the fairy lady was. He might be able to fight her when he ascended in his previous life, but nobody in Chaotian was her equal now, even though it was merely a strand of her fairy awareness or a replica that came to the human world. Even if he could kill this replica of Bai Ren, Bai Zhao, who was possessed by her, would die together with her. Yet, he would still try to kill her if he had the chance. It was not because he was brave and fearless, nor was it because he was heartless. It was something he had to do, otherwise all of them would die that day. Lien Sanue didn't kneel down, of course. She looked at Bai Zhao in the sky in silence. There was no pity in her eyes, but absolute calmness, just like her voice. Whether it's right or wrong, we'll find out after we fight. Having said that, she flew up from the square and broke through the air, her dress ruffling slightly. In a few seconds, she had entered the gray dark cloud. The moment she disappeared into the dark cloud, the fairy lady Byron had also disappeared from the same spot, heading to a higher place. Lien Sanue and the fairy lady Byron looked at each other from a distance of 10 miles. This was the empty realm. It was windless and soundless, because there was no air. If they fought here, the energy waves would be much smaller, and Chao Tian would suffer less damage. The passage in the dark cloud was soon filled up again, and the people couldn't see those scenes anymore. Even though some cultivation practitioners could go to the empty realm to watch the fight, who would dare do so? Countless people walked out from behind the palace walls, from the palace halls and from the canopies of the boats. They looked up at the sky with their heads raised, looking like the geese waiting to be fed. The clouds were suddenly illuminated. The light must have come from a higher place, but nobody knew what was happening up there. All of a sudden, a thin line appeared in the clouds, and then it broke off abruptly. A figure dropped down at a high speed like a shooting star. It was none other than Lien Sanue. The booming sounds could be heard in the sky, which were caused by the objects colliding with the air at a high speed. The people fled in all directions in fear. The great formation of the royal palace that had been reactivated was broken through easily. The shooting star landed on the square. Countless cracks appeared on the hard green rocks, looking like spider webs. Lien Sanue fell in the middle of the spider webs, motionless. Chapter 621. In the hermit peaks of Aoyama. Zhao Leu sat cross-legged on the stone bed, recuperating with her eyes closed. Zhuoruzhui sat on the ground and leaned against the edge of the stone bed, sleeping with his eyes closed. Gu Qing and Yuan Chu stood by the stone gate of the manor cave, studying something. They hadn't given up hope even though they had been locked up in the hermit peaks for many days. Sitting by the chessboard, Tong Yen was lost in thought while looking at the scattered chess pieces, lost in thought. The stone gate of the manor cave opened slowly. Zhao Leu opened her eyes, but she didn't strike or try to leave the cave. Outside the stone gate was a patch of gloomy and cold darkness, which was the mountain-like body of the dead dog. All of a sudden, she covered her chest with her hands, a surprised expression showing in her eyes. A blood-red sword light illuminated the manor cave. The thoughtless sword leaped out from her body and passed through her palm, turning into a red line and entering the crack of the stone gate, heading toward the horizon at an unimaginably high speed. In the meantime, a tearing sound broke out in the manor cave, which was the sound of the coarse cloth being torn apart. The sword of the universe shot out from the cloth and headed toward the horizon as well. Gu Qing chased after it for 2 steps, but it was impossible for him to catch up with it. Nobody dared leave the manor cave, because the dead dog was right outside. It was then that Tong Yen stood up from the table and came to the exit of the manor cave. Looking at the huge body as dark as the night sky through the increasingly narrow crack of the door, she said, "I have a story." Zhuoruzhui opened his eyes and said listlessly, "He doesn't have any wine." It was deathly quiet in the royal city of Zhaoga. Countless gazes were fixed on Lien Sanue, full of worry and shock. Was this the consequence of fighting with the fairy lady? Even though she was the strongest swordsman in Chaotian as mentioned by the immortal Tan, she would still be killed in a single strike. It was then that a peculiar sound broke out in the quiet square. It sounded like the sound of a sugar cane being snapped in half, or someone smashing a hard rock with a bone. Lien Sanyue stood up slowly by pushing herself against the ground with her hands. She warmed up her wrists and neck a bit. The sound came from her body. She staggered a little after taking 2 steps, as if she had drunk too much. In fact, she was getting used to her body. She rubbed her neck and looked up at the dark clouds in the sky. Cries of alarm rang out in the palace. People were not shocked that she had lost so quickly, because it was inevitable. Her opponent was an immortal. What shocked everyone was that she actually didn't die. She could still stand up and even fight again. Lien Sanyue flew up from the ground again. Everyone's gazes followed her, rising higher and higher until she disappeared into the clouds. Then, everything returned to normal. Time passed slowly. It seemed like a long time had passed, but in fact, only a few breaths had passed. A thin line appeared in the clouds again, and the shooting star appeared in the sky again. Lien Sanyue was knocked down to the ground again. With a loud bang, a spider web once again appeared on the square of the palace. People looked at her in the middle of the web with complicated emotions. A moment later, Lien Sanyue stood up again. She rubbed her neck and took a look at the gray sky. She wiped the blood off the corner of her mouth and flew up again. It didn't take long for her to descend again. A third patch of spider web appeared on the square. It took her a little longer to stand up this time. Her clothes were soaked with blood, and her face was a bit pale, but there was no fear in her eyes. Looking at the gray sky, she cursed expressionlessly, and then flew up again. She flew up and then fell down. She rose up and fell down again. This process went on for who knew how many times. It was deathly quiet in the royal palace. The only sounds were the thunders when she broke through the air, and the loud thuds when she hit the ground. The ground was quaking incessantly. The number of spider webs had increased gradually, and they were on the verge of joining together. Seeing this scene, the people felt a sense of awe in their hearts. Who in the world dared attack the fairy lady? Who could survive until now in the face of the fairy lady, and keep on fighting despite being defeated? Her opponent was nevertheless a fairy lady. No matter how hard she fought, she was still defeated. Many people had noticed that it took her more and more time to stand up, but they didn't notice that the time she stayed in the empty realm was increasing as well. The clouds broke open again, and the shooting star illuminated Zhaoga City again. The ground quaked again. She was lying in the middle of a patch of spider web again. Lying on the ground with her eyes closed, her face pale, she didn't get up for a long time. Was she unable to hold on any longer this time? Everybody fixed their gazes on Lien Sanyue in the middle of the square, full of nervousness and worry. Time passed slowly. She still didn't get up after a long time. A yell came out from somewhere, "Senior Master, please get up." Lien Sanyue still didn't get up. Time continued to move forward, and after an unknown amount of time, just as many people were beginning to despair, she slowly opened her eyes. Looking at the gray sky, she didn't show any fear, but she felt a bit tired. She propped up her tired body with her fists, and stood up slowly. Then, she turned her head and spat out a mouthful of saliva. Pah! That mouthful of bloody saliva fell into one of the cracks, piercing in like a stone, and then it began to burn. Lien Sanyue flew up into the sky again. The rims of her dress rubbed against the air, creating bright sparks, looking like a shooting star moving in the opposite direction. Seeing this, the people were stunned speechless. She had been struck down to the ground by the fairy lady so many times, but she was still alive, and her fighting intent was still so strong. It was impossible. Above the empty realm, Byron stood in the sky a few miles away, her whole body enshrouded in a golden glow, exuding a sacred aura. Lien Sanyue leaped out from the clouds. She grabbed a ray of morning sunlight with her right hand and condensed an unimaginably large amount of energy of heaven and earth into a vague spear, which she then hurled toward Byron. The spear was as fast as lightning and noiselessly passed through Byron's body, but it didn't cause any harm to her. Byron looked at Lien Sanyue in silence, and said through her spiritual awareness, "I didn't expect you to use the fairy book I left behind." It was true that Lien Sanyue could hold on for such a long time in this fight, not because her cultivation state had reached the same level as the fairy lady, but because she had an almost endless amount of fairy energy in her body. Before Byron ascended, she had left 3 main fairy books and 3 accessory fairy books for the Cloud Dream Mountain. Among them, the fairy book of suppressing demons was used in the battle to kill the king of the underworld, and the fairy book of longevity was used by the Zhongzhou school as a prize in the Dao competition, which was obtained by Jingjiu. What the Zhongzhou school didn't expect was that Jingjiu had tempered the fairy awareness in the fairy book and then infused all of the fairy energy into Lien Sanyue's body. Lien Sanyue had slept in the Shuiyu nunnery for many years, and had finally transformed all of the fairy energy into her own Zhen Yuan. As a result, she had fully recovered from her injuries, and her prowess was much stronger than before. "I've used 1 fairy book, and so have you. We both have the same amount of fairy energy in our bodies, so it's not easy for you to kill me." Looking at Byron in the distance, she opened her arms slowly. The morning sunlight shone on her body, and the ends of her tousling black hair exuded a golden breeze. It was all the fairy energy. This was her strongest state. The immortal Tan had to admit defeat, because Lien Sanyue was the true fairy lady in the human world. No matter how strong he and Ko Qintong were, they were no match for her. Again, Lien Sanyue turned into a straight golden line, heading toward Byron in the distance. Chapter 622. Countless thunderous booms came out from behind the clouds and reached the ears of everybody on the ground. Yet, the clouds didn't change at all. They still looked like a gray blanket blocking the whole sky. As a result, the people couldn't see the fight that didn't belong to the human world. All of a sudden, a bulge appeared at the bottom of the clouds, and then it began to rotate, turning into the shape of a tornado and moving toward the palace. Along with the whistling wind, Lien Sanyue shot out from the patch of clouds and headed toward the grand hall of the royal palace at a high speed. As she was about to land on the roof of the grand hall, she stopped short and stood on the roof. The ocean of clouds rolled up and down, and then a path appeared. Byron's white dress was tousling, devoid of any dust or bloodstain. It was a stark contrast to Lien Sanyue, who was covered in blood. "Though you have a part of my fairy energy in your body, you don't have the fairy awareness. How can you defeat me?" She said this calmly while looking at Lien Sanyue. The fairy awareness was the awareness. However, the fairy people who had ascended had surpassed the scope of Chaotian and stood in a higher state. As such, they had a more complete understanding of the lower world, and they could see all the details. If Chaotian could be described as an Aoyama, the ascendants could see the outline and shape of this mountain when they came to the sky, and they could also see all the details on the mountain, like the manor caves, the trees and the more minute objects. For a cultivation practitioner like Lien Sanyue, no matter how powerful she was, it was hard for her to know what the mountain looked like, and it was hard for her to know that there was an unknown manor cave not far away from her. Looking at this mountain, the fairy lady Byron knew where she was. She was in the mountain, but she couldn't tell where Byron was in the sky, and she couldn't even tell how far she was. The difference in the level of awareness would make a significant difference. Lien Sanyue couldn't hit the fairy lady Byron in the fight that day, and she was knocked down from the sky by her opponent again and again. It was because her opponent had an overwhelming advantage in this aspect. If her body hadn't been healed by the endless fairy energy, she would have been dead a long time ago. Even though she was still alive and able to fight, the wound in her body could break out at any moment. If the situation persisted, she would die sooner or later, and death would be her final defeat. Lien Sanyue's black hair tousled slightly, her countenance nonchalant. The golden fairy energy came out from her body. Seeing this, Bai Zhenren, Buqiuxiao, and the other cultivation practitioners were all shocked and surprised. Why was there so much immortal energy in her body? Lien Sanwé disappeared from the grand hall and came before Byron. Along with her came countless rays of morning light. It seemed that she intended to use the method she had used to deal with the immortal Tan and Jingzhou earlier. She used the heaven-human connection to control the movement of Byron and then launched the most violent attack. Even though the space on the square of the royal palace was broken, it still could not stop Byron. She was a real fairy, and she could see countless paths that people in the mountains could not see. The ribbon fluttered in the wind and disappeared in the next moment. Byron appeared behind Lien Sanwé and pointed her finger at her. Her fine fingertips released great radiance as if they were pearls. Terrifying immortal energy was contained within. It seemed that Lien Sanwé had guessed that Byron would appear behind her. Lien Sanwé turned around to face Byron, her black hair tousling again. Byron pushed her finger forward and hit the center of Lien Sanwé's brows precisely with a "pa" sound. Boom, 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 boom. Countless claps of thunder resounded in the square. The eunuchs and ministers who had fainted were jolted awake. They looked confused, not knowing what had just happened. Countless chi waves rushed out in all directions, like tens of thousands of war horses. The momentum was astonishing. The imperial city's great array collapsed upon contact, and the already dilapidated palace walls on both sides collapsed in an instant. Lien Sanwé landed on the ground, but she didn't fall down, she was still standing. The cobwebs on the ground finally connected into one. Accompanied by the extremely ear-piercing sound of rocks rubbing against each other and the sound of heavy objects pressing against each other, smoke and dust flew in all directions. The entire square of the palace actually sank by 1 foot. Unexpectedly, the fairy lady Byron had also landed from the sky. She was still standing in front of Lien Sanwé, her fingertips still touching the center of her brows. A drop of dark red blood gradually flowed out from between his eyebrows, like a cinnabar mole. Lien Sanwé said while staring into Byron's eyes, "Welcome to the mountain." After saying this, the drop of blood suddenly shone brightly. Immortal energy rose and enveloped the two of them inside. She had forced out all the fairy energy in her body. The fairy energy kept on attacking Lien Sanwé's body through Byron's finger. The expression in Byron's eyes changed a bit. She didn't understand why Lien Sanwé wanted to do this. It took Byron only a brief moment to figure it out. As she was about to pull back her finger, she found that she couldn't do so. The fairy energy in this body and the fairy energy in Lien Sanwé's body had the same origin, and they were even from the same person. They were naturally close to each other, and they didn't want to separate from each other when they met. All they wanted to do was to merge with each other again. Byron drifted backward. She intended to pull her fingertip away from the center of Lien Sanwé's brows, but she couldn't pull her finger away from the center of Lien Sanwé's brows because of a very thin thread. The thread looked like gold or jade, extremely sticky and tenacious. It was formed by the essence of the fairy energy. The zither has 50 strings. I don't know how to play it. I only need 1 string. Lien Sanwé didn't know how to play the zither. Back when she participated in the plum meeting under the name of Guodong, she played only 1 string. She had employed the endless sword style of Qingrong Peak to release her fairy energy. Of course, it was a sword style that she had modified. Before the fairy energy in Lien Sanwé's body completely disappeared, Byron's fingertip couldn't be pulled away from her. Byron looked at her expressionlessly. This move is called the flower in the mirror and the moon reflected in water. Having said that, Lien Sanwé's entire body turned illusionary as she thrust her palm toward Byron. It was unclear whether the flower in the mirror and the moon reflected in water referred to the movement or the palm strike. This palm strike looked quite ordinary, like a gentle breeze brushing the willow branches. It couldn't be compared to the fists she had used to strike Ko Qingtong's body. Bai Run had tempered the fairy book for many years at the Zhongzhou school. The body of Bai Zhao, which Bai Run had occupied, had been modified over a long period of time. Like Lien Sanyue's body, it was almost immaculate and unharmed, so it was hard to injure him, to say nothing of such a casual palm strike. The expression on Lien Sanyue's face was as mild as this palm strike, but it was also exceedingly serious. "Pa!" The palm landed on his chest. Bai Zhao's body shook slightly. His hair tousled. The ribbon tousled. The cloth tousled. All the objects drifting in the air emitted a few green glows. The green glows left Bai Zhao's body and drifted further away, gradually forming a human figure. The human figure suddenly emitted a golden glow, surrounded by the fairy energy. It was none other than the replica of the fairy lady Bai Ren. There was a burst of surprised screams in the royal palace. The crowd was extremely shocked. Lien Sanyue had used such a simple palm strike to knock the fairy lady Bai Ren out of Bai Zhao's body. How did she do it? I've always wanted to write this part of the plot as the one where the Ancient One hits someone, but I can't think of a reasonable explanation. I've been revising the ending of the Qing dynasty recently. Though I haven't reached Mount Dadong yet, I've suddenly thought of the method the Qing emperor used to hit Ku He. Chapter 623. Though it seemed difficult to explain, the principle was actually quite simple. Lien Sanyue used the endless sword style to condense the fairy energy into a thread and use the thread to form a bridge to prevent Bai Ren from leaving. In other words, she had pulled Bai Ren back to the mountain in Chaotian from the sky. Then, she had infused most of the fairy energy in her body into Bai Zhao's body through the bridge, which was Bai Ren's finger. Bai Zhao's body had been modified by the fairy energy and the fairy awareness in the fairy book for many years, so it was strong enough to withstand a replica of Bai Ren's body. However, the amount of fairy energy in her body had increased by 1-fold all of a sudden, so her body couldn't withstand it and was on the verge of collapsing. If Bai Ren didn't want to die in this explosion of fairy energy, she had no choice but to leave this body and bring most of the fairy energy with her. In order to ensure that Bai Zhao was still alive, she had to ensure that she could stay in Chaotian for a while longer. The fairy energy in Lien Sanyue's body had been used up, so the golden thread had dissipated in the air. The expression in Bai Zhao's eyes suddenly grew perplexed, and then he came back to his senses. He realized what had happened over the years and that day, and his face grew pale. He couldn't withstand the double impact of the spiritual energy and the fairy energy, falling into Lien Sanyue's bosom. "Senior Master, is that you?" she asked bewilderedly while looking at the ordinary face that looked beautiful because of the drop of blood between her eyebrows. "Don't talk. Take a rest first." Lien Sanyue walked toward the grand hall while holding Bai Ren in her arms. Bai Ren drifted up to the sky. She was not a real person at the moment, but an image condensed from the fairy energy particles. Her entire body exuded a sacred intent, and her skirt looked as beautiful as the clouds when it tore in the wind. She was the true fairy lady. Countless people knelt down before her again. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school were extremely excited, thinking that they had finally seen the true appearance of their ancestor and felt that their lives had been worthwhile. Bai Run had already understood what Lien Sanyue intended to do when she heard what Lien Sanyue said. Looking at the back of Lien Sanyue walking toward the grand hall, an appreciative expression showed in her eyes. "You're really good," she said. "Even though I can't stay in the lower world for a long time, I can still kill all of you. It's because I'm the real me now." Lien Sanyue didn't even turn her head around, she didn't even pay any attention to her. She had no fairy energy now, so she couldn't fight anymore. She had no choice but to leave the rest to someone else. Suddenly, a series of shattering sounds rang out in the hall, as if all the expensive porcelain in Duke Lu's bedroom had been smashed at the same time. The ray of morning light that ignored the dark clouds and landed on the stone steps suddenly shattered and disappeared without a trace. Ping Yongka spat out a mouthful of blood and fainted. Jingjiu flew into the sky and looked at Bai Ren with a calm expression. His clothes and the ends of his hair carried a faint sword light, as if they had been painted by an artist on purpose. Bai Ren looked at him in silence and said, "I didn't expect you to be alive." Jingjiu said nothing. His sword moved at will, and countless sword wills emanated from his body. They were extremely majestic and sharp. These sword wills enshrouded the whole royal palace. All the cultivation practitioners who used swords could sense that their flying swords didn't obey their commands and wanted to fly toward the square. There were very few sword sects that came to Zhaoga City today, and the Kunlun sect was the largest among them. Whether it was the sect master He Wei or the few elders, they all found that their swords were being guided by some invisible force. They were shocked and hastily mobilized their sword source to guard their hearts. Yet, how could they guard their swords? A few sword lights flew out from the bodies of the elders of the Kunlun sect. Fortunately, they didn't fly away, but aimed at the sky. He Wei had the highest cultivation state, so he struggled the longest, and the consequence was the most severe. He spat out a mouthful of fresh blood, and the sect master sword came out along with the blood, pointing toward the sky as well. All these swords aimed at Bai Ren according to Jingjiu's will. Lian Sanwei returned to the stone steps and sat down while holding Bai Zhao in her arms. She turned around and looked at the sky, a hint of worry showing in her eyes. It was the same as how Jingjiu had looked at her earlier. Having just woken up, Bai Zhao couldn't get used to the fairy energy in his body yet. His face was extremely pale and cold. Leaning against Lian Sanwei's bosom, he murmured while trembling, "What can I do?" "Don't worry," said Lian Sanwei. "He likes to show off. Let him do it himself." The cold signal bird felt a bit displeased when he sensed the dampness on his head, but he sensed that He Wei was in a bad mood, so he didn't do anything. The abnormal situation of the Kunlun sect and the other sword sects was actually caused by the sword wills emitted by Jingjiu. In fact, Jingjiu merely shouted, "Swords, come here," using the sword wills in the sky. The flying swords of the Kunlun sect and these sword sects happened to hear it, and they all rushed out in a panic. Yet, what Jingjiu shouted was not these swords, but his own swords. Standing at the entrance of the grand hall, Jing Yao looked at the sky worriedly. All of a sudden, he felt his right hand, which was placed on the hilt of his sword, go numb. Clang! The first child's sword came out of the sheath and turned into a desolate sword light, flying to the high sky. In the next moment, a blood-red line came from the south. It flew close to the bottom of the clouds at an unimaginable speed and arrived in the high sky as well. The expression on Lu Shui, who was recuperating in the cabin of the boat of diligent study, suddenly changed. Shi Yun was worried that Ko Qingtong's demonic energy hadn't been purged yet, so he asked, "What's wrong?" Along with a crisp sound, the sword bracelet on Lu Shui's wrist broke off, turning into a bright, sharp, and short flying sword, which flew out reluctantly. Shi Yun was stunned. He helped Lu Shui to the deck, his line of sight following the small sword to the high sky. The sword of the universe was the last to arrive. As it appeared in the sky above Zhaoga City, the dark clouds covering the whole sky grew a bit colder, as if they were not in the human world. The thoughtless sword, the first child sword, the sword of the universe, and the lone sword. These were all the swords of Jingjiu. Though Jingjiu had given these four swords to Zhao Liu, Jingyao, Gu Qing, and Lu Shui, these swords would come back to him when he needed them. In terms of their states, these four swords were all of the fairy state, and they were of the best quality. If the famous swords in Chaotian were ranked, these four swords would definitely be ranked in the top 10. The lone sword and the first child sword were even qualified to compete for the second place. The four famous swords arrived in the sky above Zhaoga City, each occupying a spot. The distance between them was not exactly the same, but they were somehow connected to each other. They formed the Dubhe, exuding an exceedingly formidable sword wills. Byron felt it odd. She disappeared from the original spot and arrived in the sky a few miles away. The four swords seemed to be in the same spots as before, but they still surrounded her. They aimed at her in silence, increasing their sword wills. Crack! The clouds rolled up and squeezed out countless bolts of lightning, landing on the four swords at the same time. Innumerable blue electric arcs surrounded these flying swords, generating more powerful sword wills, which seemed to be able to cut open the space and even the higher realm, blocking Bajunren in this patch of sky, making it impossible for her to leave easily. It was evident that this was a sword formation. It was formed by four flying swords, but it was powerful enough to destroy heaven and earth. The expression on Byron's face grew grave. She asked Jingjiu in the distance, "What formation is this?" "The sword formation of slaying fairies," replied Jingjiu. Chapter 6:24. Jingjiu's voice came to the ground from the high sky like a sword sound, and then spread out. There was an uproar in Zhaoga City. Everybody was stunned. Wasn't the sword formation of slaying fairies something in the legends? Like the rosefinch, it had lost its inheritance a long time ago, but why did it reappear in the hands of Jingjiu? The disciples of the Zhongzhou school had a more complicated emotion. The name of the sword formation of slaying fairies was an ominous omen for them. The swordsmen of various sects were more surprised by another matter. It was that the fairy lady Byron couldn't get rid of this seemingly simple sword formation. It was because the sword formation of slaying fairies set up by Jingjiu was exceedingly powerful, but the controller of the sword formation had to be able to detect the whereabouts of the fairy lady Byron. If one looked at the sun in the sky from a mountain, how could one know how far the sun was from them? If one couldn't even know the distance, how could one determine the position of the opponent? Lien Sanyue had demonstrated an incredible cultivation state and fighting prowess that day, and could be considered the strongest swordsman in Chaotian, but she still had no chance of winning against the fairy lady Byron. How could Jingjiu achieve such a feat? It suddenly occurred to them that he might be the immortal Jingyang, and they vaguely understood something. It was true that Jingjiu had succeeded in ascension before. Though he was sneak-attacked by Byron and forced to return to Chaotian, and his cultivation state was not high, he had possessed a consciousness beyond the scope of this world. In terms of the level of consciousness, he was the only person in Chaotian who could be compared to Byron. "Do you think you can kill me this way?" Byron said this calmly while looking at Jingjiu outside the sword formation, and then she waved her sleeve slightly. An indescribably strong pressure spread in all directions along with the extremely faint metal wind. The few strands of clouds falling from the sky were instantly turned into nothingness. It was quiet in the sky above Zhaoga City, except for the boundless dark clouds, which looked like a huge iron plate pressing down on everything, giving off a depressing feeling. The faint golden wind looked intoxicating, but it was many times more dreadful than the chaotic wind in the high sky. Wherever it passed, nothing could survive. The blood-red sword light of the thoughtless sword grew dimmer instantly. The body of the sword of the universe started to burn fiercely. It was no longer as desolate as before. The first child's sword was covered with a layer of dust. It didn't look as desolate anymore. The lone sword was the most unbearable. It had already begun to dodge before the metal wind reached its body, but it couldn't avoid it completely. Specks of rust appeared on its incomparably smooth body, making it look extremely ugly. The spiritual chi of the four immortal flying swords was instantly damaged, and the immortal slaying sword formation was naturally not as powerful as before, and its killing intent was greatly weakened. Obviously, Byron only had to attack a few more times before she could break out of the formation, because this was not the complete version of the fairy slaying sword formation. He also needed a sword. Jingjiu entered the celestial slaying sword formation. His body movement was like that of an immortal or a ghost. He appeared every time he was more than 10 miles away. Like a twinkling star, he occupied 17 star positions in a row. He arrived in front of Bai Ren and pointed his finger at the spot between her eyebrows. He was the sharpest and most powerful sword in Chaotian. As the all-in-one sword slashed open the path of stars, the god-slaying sword formation became stable again and even more powerful. Its murderous nature had also increased by many folds. The thoughtless sword and the other 3 flying swords moved along with Jingjiu, their sword wills coming out and pointing at Bai Ren. Bai Ren didn't show any fear. Her hands bloomed like a lotus flower, exuding a large amount of fairy energy. The 4 formidable flying swords arrived and landed on the layer of fairy energy, leaving only 4 shallow marks on it. The 4 sword marks formed a E character. Jingjiu pointed his finger at the center of the E character. An ear-piercing cutting sound rang out. Countless sparks shot up in the sky and dropped down to the ground like a waterfall of fire. However, the sparks vanished without a trace after falling a few hundred feet. Bai Ren said to Jingjiu through the sparks in the sky, "These swords are not enough. If you hadn't given her the fairy energy, we might have had a chance." Jingjiu pulled back his right hand. The fairy energy was only half a foot thick, but it seemed to be the most powerful barrier in heaven and earth. It was impossible to break through it. Jingjiu said, "It's not enough. I'll give you more." After the fairy lady Bai Ren arrived, Yu Qianmen and the other 3 valley masters stopped pursuing Tai Pingzhenren and returned to their respective cloud boats under the command of Bai Zhenren. The fighting scene in the sky was shocking. Even though they were swordsmen in the Lianshu state, they were still in a trance. It was then that they received the latest order from Bai Zhenren. They couldn't help but feel startled. Yu Qianmen objected to it, which was rare for him to do. The fairy lady Bai Ren would kill Jingjiu soon, and then Lian Sanyue, Jing Yao and all the enemies of the Zhongzhou school would come. Intimidated by her, Bu Qiuxiao and Zen Master didn't dare make a move. Even if the Aoyama sect had hidden some swordsmen in Zhaoga City, they wouldn't dare make a move. Why did she break her promise and order the cloud boats to attack Zhaoga City? Bai Zhenren was the only one who knew that it was because the fairy lady had been forced out of Bai Zhao's body by Lian Sanyue and couldn't stay in Chaotian for too long, so she had to leave. If the fairy lady left, the situation would change. The Zhongzhou school had to seize the opportunity to take control of the great formation of the royal palace and kill Jing Yao, so that everything would be settled in the end. No matter what Yu Qianmen and the other elders thought, the immortal Tan had already left Zhaoga City, and the Zhongzhou school would be under the control of Bai Zhenren. A dozen cloud boats started moving again, heading toward Zhaoga City at a faster and faster speed, bringing up a great amount of strong wind. Bu Qiuxiao was the first to notice the commotion in the south of the city, feeling furious. The immortal Tan and Jingjiu had agreed that the Zhongzhou school and the Aoyama sect would win 3 out of 5 fights. It was only the 3rd fight. Even if the fairy lady Bai Ren was undefeatable, what about the immortal Tan? As the house master of Yamatsai, he couldn't allow such a betrayal to happen. He picked up the dragon-tail inkstone, ready to lead the disciples into the royal palace. The cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school seemed to be on the horizon a moment ago, but they arrived in Zhaoga City in the next moment. The 3 cloud boats in the front had even entered the territory of the royal palace. The scene looked exceedingly dreadful against the backdrop of the dark clouds. The people who were paying attention to the fight in the high sky didn't notice the unusual phenomenon until now, screaming in surprise. The divine crossbows on the city wall raised their heads slowly and shot the arrows into the sky. The arrows exploded in the belly of the cloud boats, creating a series of green glows. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school employed their magic treasures to block the arrows, covering the sky and covering the earth. The 2 Sir Golden Ox and Sir Golden Ox eyed each other, saying nothing. The great formation of the royal palace had been destroyed by the fight between Lien Sanyue and the fairy lady Bai Ren, so it couldn't keep those cloud boats out. The royal palace was on the verge of being occupied. They had no choice but to fight to the death. Who could have thought that Bai Zhenren could be so ruthless and shameless? In the restaurant, Qing asked nervously while looking at the cloud boats in the sky, "What should we do now? What should we do?" Yin San suddenly turned to the south, exclaiming with furrowed brows, "He's even crazier than me." The dark clouds in the sky were as calm as a carpet. All of a sudden, a thin thread of cloud appeared in the clouds. It looked like a strand of hair curling up from a distance. Only those cultivation practitioners with good eyesight could find that the tip of the thread of cloud was a sword. The sword was quite ordinary, devoid of anything special. It was so ordinary that it didn't attract anyone's attention when it appeared. The sword dropped down from the clouds and landed on the cloud boat in the front. It wasn't until it was close to the cloud boat that the disciples of the Zhongzhou school discovered it. The Zhongzhou school thought that the disciples of the Aoyama had finally arrived, so they were cheered up. The formation at the head of the boat was activated, and a green light shot toward the sword. With a light "pa" sound, the flying sword was directly sent flying, and then fell into the ruins of the palace wall like a stone. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school on the cloud boat were taken aback when they saw that the sword had blocked the attack of the disciples of the Aoyama so easily. The chief of the valley said in a mocking tone, "How dare you come here to make a fool of yourself?" It was then that another thin thread came out from the bottom of the calm clouds, and the tip of the thread was an ordinary flying sword. In the next moment 10, 100, 1,000 and countless thin threads came out from the bottom of the calm clouds. The tip of each thin thread was a flying sword. At the moment, the clouds looked like a piece of gray felt that had been used for many years, with countless ends of the threads growing out from it. Countless flying swords pierced through the clouds and dropped down from the sky. Seeing this, the chief of the valley turned pale and yelled sternly, "Defend!" The cloud boat activated the formation to the maximum. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school didn't have time to worry about the divine crossbows shooting at them from the rear. They used all their magic treasures to block the countless flying swords falling down from the sky. Countless surprised screams broke out in Zhaoga City. The people were terrified to the extreme. In their eyes, there was nothing else in heaven and earth except for the swords. Swords. Swords were everywhere. Countless swords fell down like raindrops, and the whistling of the swords could be heard everywhere. The formidable sword wills seemed to be able to pierce through the heaven and earth. It was like a violent thunderstorm. There was no way an umbrella could block it. In an instant, the formation of the cloud boat collapsed, and the spiritual sails were torn to pieces. A flying sword pierced deeply into the deck of the boat, creating a crack. Soon after, more swords fell down and cut the deck into pieces. The wood shavings and iron pieces were flying everywhere in the cloud boat, mixed with blood and horrible screams. The disciples of the Zhongzhou school died in the rain of swords one after another. The chief of the valley let out a desperate roar and activated all his cultivation state, thrusting toward the sky. The rain of swords in the sky sensed his formidable power and deviated slightly, as if they were blown by the wind. As a result, the rain on his side became heavier. Boom! Hundreds of flying swords pierced through his body, giving off a muffled sound. In an instant, this powerful swordsman in the Lianshu state turned into a puff of bloody mist. In a few seconds, the cloud boat was riddled with holes by the rain of swords in the sky, falling apart and falling to the ground like a dead whale. In the high sky, beneath the dark clouds, whoosh, 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 countless flying swords came out of the clouds one after another, brushing past Jingzhou and Bai Ren, heading toward Zhaoga City. Seeing this, Bai Ren asked with a cold expression in her eyes, "What is this?" Jingzhou asked, "Have you ever heard of a sword style called falling from the sky?" Chapter 6:25. There was a region of Aoyama in the south, and there was a cluster of hermit peaks in Aoyama. There was a manor cave in one of the peaks. Perhaps it was because the story Tong Yen told was so good that the stone door of the manor cave wasn't closed this time. As Zhao Liu and the others walked out from the manor cave, they found the thoughtless sword and the sword of the universe had already disappeared into the horizon, nowhere to be seen. This was a speed that Zhao Liu and Gu Qing couldn't achieve no matter how hard they tried. Leaving the manor cave didn't mean that they could leave the hermit peak. They stood in the midst of the green peaks, reticent. A white line suddenly appeared in the sky, with a flying sword at the front end of the line. In the next moment, countless white lines streaked across the blue sky like combs. They were innumerable swords leaving Aoyama, heading toward the north, like a heavy rain or a huge white ribbon. Seeing this, Yuan Chu opened his mouth wide, and Zhuoruzhui opened his eyes wide. Gu Qing was also bewildered, wondering what was going on. Zhao Liu recalled an event that had happened many years ago. That day, she and Jingjiu were about to enter Haizhou City, and the Pure Heaven Bureau issued a warrant for their arrest. The swordsmen of the Orthodox sects gathered there. Zhao Liu was worried. Jingjiu asked her a question. "Have you ever heard of a sword style called descending from the sky?" A few years ago, when she and Jingjiu walked on the sword peak, the swords in the peaks suddenly became restless. Zhao Liu asked Jingjiu what was going on, and Jingjiu repeated the same question. She knew what this sword style of descending from the sky was, or in other words, what it meant. This is the sword formation of Aoyama. Hearing what Zhao Liu said, Yuan Chu, Zhuoruzhui and Gu Qing were stunned speechless while looking at the spectacular scene in the sky. Zhuoruzhui suddenly sensed the sword pill quiver slightly, and the swallowing boat sword expressed its intention to leave. "Since I can't go with you, you go with me." He waved his hand with a faint smile. The swallowing boat sword pierced through the air, turned into a gray shadow, and flew into the sky at a speed that it had never shown before. Immediately after, Yuan Chu also felt something. He waved his hand and released his strange sword. The strange sword quickly merged into the sky full of swords. The countless swords in the sky were not all high-grade flying swords. Some were very ordinary, and some were even sword embryos. Just like that strange sword, they did not have a name yet. But these were all Aoyama swords. Countless flying swords came from the south and descended from the sky, washing the world like a torrential rain. It was the first time for the people in Zhaoga City to see such a scene, and also the first time for them to see the true sword formation of Aoyama. The first 3 cloud ships to enter the imperial city were destroyed by the rain of swords in a short period of over 10 breaths of time, and they disintegrated and fell to the ground while emitting ceaseless rumbling sounds. Most of the disciples of Zhongzhou School on the 3 cloud ships died while they were still in the sky. Some of the swordsmen survived and landed on the square. They didn't dare stay a moment longer, fleeing toward the outside of the imperial city with fear in their hearts. These swordsmen of Zhongzhou School had cultivated the escape method of heaven and earth to a very high level. Their movements were so swift that they could cover a distance of over 1,000 feet with a single leap. But how could they evade the rain of swords in the sky? No matter how powerful the escape method of heaven and earth was, it required one to travel between heaven and earth. Now that there were swords everywhere in heaven and earth, where could one evade? An elder evaded a few flying swords. As he was about to approach the palace wall, a silver-colored flying sword pierced his thigh. He fell to the ground after letting out a horrible shriek. Then the swords pierced through his body, and he died with a spurt of blood. The same scene could be seen everywhere in the square of the imperial city. The horrible shrieks of the swordsmen of Zhongzhou School could be heard everywhere. What was more frightening was the sound of the flying swords piercing through the human bodies and the hard green stones. As far as the eye could see, the splattering blood and stone chips could be seen everywhere, and the corpses were everywhere. Innumerable flying swords were nailed to the ground, swaying slightly in the wind, looking like wild grass. This was what it meant to kill people like grass. Many people fainted after seeing this scene. The cultivation practitioners murmured with extremely pale faces, "Is this the great formation of Aoyama?" The frightened screams of the chancellors in the grand hall could be heard constantly. "Is this the great formation of Aoyama?" Yes, this was the rumored great formation of Aoyama. The great Grandmaster Nanchu, the great Grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect, and Emperor Shao were all extraordinary swordsmen, but they had become the pitiful hidden swordsmen, unable to see the light of day for the rest of their lives. In fact, many people couldn't understand it. It was because they hadn't witnessed the scene that day. Who could resist such a powerful great formation of Aoyama? Countless small holes appeared in the dark clouds in the high sky, and they couldn't be closed. Those small holes were actually the sword eyes. Yet, nobody knew that the rain of swords falling down from Zhaoga City was not the most powerful attack of the sword formation of Aoyama. The most formidable attack had already been completed in the high sky. Jingjiu and Bai Ren had separated from each other a few miles apart. The small holes were everywhere on Bai Ren's clothes, which looked similar to the clouds. She was an absolute spiritual body condensed by the fairy energy at the moment, and her clothes were a part of her. As such, those small holes were the real injuries on her clothes. Countless strands of fairy energy were seeping out from those small holes like golden threads, dispersing in heaven and earth. The process was slow, but it was irreversible. "Is this the sword formation of Aoyama?" asked Bai Ren while looking at Jingjiu. "Yes," said Jingjiu. "So you can die now." This was the story of the day. Lien Sanyue pulled Bai Ren out from Bai Zhao's body, and Jingjiu trapped her with the sword formation of slaying fairies and then killed her with the sword of Aoyama. This story was simple, but it was very good. If he wanted to kill Bai Ren and let Bai Zhao live, this was the only possible way to write the story. "You are indeed someone who has gone out," said Bai Ren. "You are indeed someone who has gone out. You have a good method. I hope you can still employ the sword formation of Aoyama when I come back next time." She was a true fairy lady, so she could tell at a glance that Jingjiu had paid a great price to employ the sword formation of Aoyama, and that he might die in the next moment. "I dare employ the sword formation of Aoyama, because I can calculate everything. But you, at least you won't have a chance to come back this time." Having said that, Jingjiu disappeared from the original spot, and reappeared a few miles away. It was undoubtedly the underworld fairy sword he used. He passed through Bai Ren's body. The immortal energy that was seeping out from her clothes suddenly disappeared without a trace. Bai Ren turned to Jingjiu and found a hint of gold in his eyes. She realized what had just happened, a bewildered expression showing on her face. Whoosh! She dispersed in the high sky, turning into countless light specks and vanishing without a trace. After making sure that she was dead, Jingjiu felt relieved. He coughed twice painfully with his eyes closed. Countless thunder boomed in heaven and earth. The thunder boomed in his body. He blinked his eyelashes slightly. A drop of golden blood trickled down from the bottom of his damaged earlobe, and then spread in the sky, attracting countless birds to chase after it. After an unknown amount of time, the thunder in his body disappeared. He opened his eyes and flew towards the ground. The lone sword, the first sun, the thoughtless sword, and the sword of the universe followed him. It was deathly quiet in the royal palace of Zhaoga City. No sound of pain could be heard, and no screams could be heard. It was because the ground was full of corpses. To say nothing of the wounded, there wasn't even a complete corpse to be found. The morning wind blew over slowly, but it couldn't blow away the dreadful atmosphere and the bloody smell that seemed to be condensed like crystals. Swords were stuck everywhere on the stone step. Though Ping Yongka was still unconscious, those swords didn't hurt him. They landed precisely around him, looking like a fence protecting him, or a cradle. Jingjiu landed in front of the Grand Hall. He turned around and walked to Lien Sanyue's side after shooting a glance at Jingjiu. Seeing his pale face, Lien Sanyue asked, "Are you all right?" "I'm not going to die," replied Jingjiu. "Can you still fight?" asked Lien Sanyue. Jingjiu shook his head. It was then that a patch of cloud and fog drifted into the royal palace. As the cloud and fog dispersed, Bai Jinren walked out from it. "Who's next then?" he demanded while looking at them. Chapter 6:26. The cultivation circle considered Bai Jinren to be one of the most powerful figures in Chaotian, but the strange thing was that the cultivation practitioners didn't have a high opinion of her in private. Like Yin San, Jing Jiu and the recently deceased Ko Qingtong had all said, she was always stingy in doing things. It wasn't until now that the people had witnessed her prowess. She was truly powerful. The fairy lady Bai Rin died after turning into a light speck in the sky. The cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school were broken into pieces after being struck by the sword formation of Aoyama. At least hundreds of elders and disciples had died. Her daughter sat by Lien Sanyue with a pale face. It was evident that she was in a bad condition and would probably die soon after. Under such circumstances, she was still as calm and aloof as ever, as if the overall situation of the world was still under her control. It was not a disguise. It was because she hadn't struck yet. It was evident that Lien Sanyue and Jingjiu didn't have the strength to fight anymore. Who would fight for them then? 3 wins out of 5. The Aoyama sect has already won. The voice of Buqiuxiao rang out in the sky, steady and determined. Bai Jinren shot a glance at the boat of diligent study and asked, "Does 2 against 1 count?" Lien Sanyue and Jingjiu fought the fairy lady Bai Rin. It was indeed 2 against 1, no matter whether it was a one-on-one fight or a joint attack. Cloud Dream Mountain also has 2 people. A lotus cloud drifted over from the south, carrying the voice of Zen Master. The fairy lady Bai Ren had arrived in Bai Zeo's body. In a sense, the Zhongzhou school had 2 people. Yet, everybody was well aware that what Bai Jinren, Buqiuxiao and Zen Master said was merely an excuse. The Zhongzhou school had destroyed 3 cloud boats, killed 3 valley masters, a dozen swordsmen, and hundreds of disciples. It had already formed a blood feud with the Aoyama sect. Under the circumstances, the wager between Jingjiu and the Immortal Tan was meaningless. Looking at Bai Jinren's expressionless face in the thin mist, he knew that she would not stop today. The attack of Zhongzhou school would continue, and everyone present might die. A faintly discernible pressure fell from the boat of diligent study onto the square of the royal palace. A beautiful ray of light refracted through the mirror and landed on the square. Buqiuxiao and Zen Master were ready to strike. "If you want to die with me, that's fine." Bai Jinren ignored them and took a step towards the main hall. 1 step. The imperial city was shrouded in fog. A dreadful whistling sound broke out in the sky. The remaining 10 cloud boats were heading toward the royal palace. Yu Qianmen and other swordsmen in the Lianshu state were standing at the bow of the boats, looking around cautiously. Bai Jinren walked to the front of the main hall and said to Jingjiu on the stone steps, "The sword formation of Aoyama is indeed formidable, but can you use it one more time?" It was true that Jingjiu couldn't fight it one more time. All of a sudden, a crisp sound of a flute rang out in front of the royal palace. The sound of the flute seemed to come from the stream, from the back of an ox, and from Aoyama. A youth in red clothing walked in from the front gate of the royal palace while playing the bamboo flute. As the sound of the flute echoed in the square of the royal palace, the swords inserted in the ground began to quiver as if they had sensed a certain calling. Along with the crisp sound of friction, a dozen swords left the ground and turned into sharp lights, killing a swordsman of Zhongzhou school who attempted to enter the royal palace. In the next moment, more and more flying swords left the ground. It seemed that the sword formation of Aoyama was going to rise again. Seeing that something was wrong, the elders and apprentices of Zhongzhou school flew down from the cloud boats one after another, controlling their magic treasures and Taoist magic arts to attack the youth in red clothing. The youth in red clothing didn't seem to notice anything. He just calmly and attentively played the flute, walking toward the front of the main hall. The sound of the flute was melodious. As he moved, more and more swords began to quiver and then left the ground. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Countless flying swords danced around the youth in red clothing. They flew back and forth like lines, killing the elders and apprentices of Zhongzhou school in the sky. Yuqianmen descended from the sky and let out a roar. The magic treasure in his hand emitted a white light and pressed down on the youth in red clothing. Hundreds of flying swords of Aoyama pierced through the sky and turned into a ribbon, entangling the magic treasure directly. Along with the intensive cutting sounds like a rainstorm, the magic treasure was directly cut into pieces. The flying swords didn't stop there. They continued to soar up into the sky and pierced through Yu Qianmen's body. Yu Qianmen let out an angry and painful cry. His right arm was cut into powder by the sword will in an instant. Seriously injured, he didn't dare to stay any longer. He used the escape method of heaven and earth to return to the cloud boat. Those cloud boats that were heading toward the imperial palace felt the terrifying sword will in the sky and didn't dare to take another step forward. The youth in red clothing came to the center of the square of the imperial palace. He finally put down the bamboo flute in his hand and looked at Baizhenren in silence. The youth's eyes were delicate and kind, but the look in his eyes was so indifferent, as if he didn't care about the whole world being destroyed in front of him. Seeing this scene, everyone was stunned. They guessed that he should be Tai Pingzhenren or Yin San. I can still use the sword formation of Aoyama, Yin San said calmly while looking at Baizhenren. He was the former immortal sect master of Aoyama, so he could use the sword formation of Aoyama. The premise was that Jingjiu, who had the command token of the sect master, didn't stop him. It was obvious that Jingjiu wouldn't do that under the circumstances. Baizhenren said to Yin San expressionlessly, "Though I don't know how you have survived until now, I can tell that you are still very weak." Yin San said with a faint smile, "Even if you are a child, you can still kill a few people as long as you can pick up an iron hammer." Baizhenren said expressionlessly, "Why don't you show me the hammer?" It was the best opportunity for the Zhongzhou school to leave the city that day, and they had paid the price of a fairy book and a replica of Bairen's ancestor. If they left Zhaoga City now, all their efforts would be in vain. Everybody knew that Baizhenren wouldn't give up. The sword formation of Aoyama activated by Tai Pingzhenren with the sound of the flute was obviously different from the sword formation of Aoyama summoned by Jingjiu. Yin San said to her with a faint smile, "I don't think you have a chance." No sooner had he said this than a thunderclap broke out in the sky. The thunderclap didn't come from the dark clouds in the sky, but from the horizon 100 miles away in the northwest. It was the Cloud Dream Mountain. It was the angry roar of the unicorn. Hearing this angry roar, the people around the royal palace felt fearful, wondering if this divine animal from ancient times was going to come out of the mountains. Royal concubine whose face turned pale, wondering what she should do. Jingyao, Duke Lu and the others had a grave expression on their faces, thinking that if the Aoyama sect didn't send someone here soon, they would lose the battle for sure. Unexpectedly, after hearing the angry roar of the unicorn, Baizhenren turned into a patch of cloud and vanished from the square after shooting a glance at Yin San and Jingjiu. A dozen cloud boats retreated as quickly as they could, and soon left Zhaoga City. They didn't even care about those disciples who died in the square. Looking at the sky, the people wondered in shock what was going on. 13 Aoyama sword boats broke through the clouds and surrounded the Cloud Dream Mountain in the northwest of Zhaoga City. It was late in the spring and a snowstorm occurred in the sky. The 6 peak masters, including Yuan Qijing, Fang Jingtian, Guangyuan Zhenren, Nan Wang, Chen Yutian and Fu Wang, and Mo Qi and a dozen elders in the Broken Sea State, were all looking down from the ocean of clouds. The Aoyama sect had sent out all their swordsmen. The Aoyama sword boat in the front had already started its attack. Countless sword lights shot down from the boat, heading toward the Cloud Dream Mountain. The faint green glow kept flashing, indicating that the great formation of Cloud Dream was defending. It seemed to be fine, but for some reason it felt a bit difficult to defend. Standing at the front of the Aoyama sword boat, Tong Yen had a calm and nonchalant expression on her face. She kept calculating the weak spots and the operating rules of the great formation of Cloud Dream. She would point her finger once in a while, and the flying swords in the sky would change their direction and fly away. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.